When someone pulls away, the mind rarely stays calm. It starts replaying every word, every pause, every shift in tone. It searches for reasons, signs, meaning, and closure. But the more it searches, the more it suffers, because overthinking feels like control when it is really just pain repeating itself. That is why so many people remain trapped after someone becomes distant. It is not because they care too much. It is because they do not yet know how to return to peace. Buddhist teachings offer a different path. They teach that inner peace does not come from chasing answers or forcing certainty. It comes from releasing attachment, calming the restless mind, and learning how to remain grounded even when someone you care about steps back. Tonight, as you listen, something quiet will begin to change. The mental noise will start to soften, the pressure in your heart will begin to ease, and the part of you that kept running after what pulled away will slowly come home to itself. This is not just about how to stop overthinking after someone pulls away. This is about finding inner peace when the mind wants to chase, when the heart wants to panic, and when silence feels heavier than words. Are you ready? Let's begin. Now something begins to reveal itself quietly. The moment you stop chasing what pulled away, you start noticing how much of your pain was never about the person, but about the unanswered space they left behind. The silence becomes louder than anything they ever said, and the mind, unable to sit with that silence, begins to move. It moves in circles. It searches, it questions, it replays. It tries to rebuild what is already gone. And this is where the deeper suffering begins. A strange thing happens when someone becomes distant. The connection may fade, the communication may slow, but the mind does not follow the same rhythm. It keeps reaching, it keeps asking, it keeps knocking on a door that is no longer being opened. And beneath all of that movement, there is one quiet demand that drives everything else. The need for closure. Something inside wants an answer that will make everything make sense. It wants a final sentence, a clear reason, a moment of explanation that will somehow calm the storm. It believes that if it can just understand what happened, the pain will stop. But instead, the opposite happens. The more the mind searches for closure, the more restless it becomes, because it is trying to solve something that no longer exists in the same way. The situation has already changed, but the mind is still trying to interact with it as if it can be completed. This creates a tension that does not release. The heart is waiting for something that is not coming, and the mind is trying to force an ending that another person has not chosen to give. And in this quiet struggle, energy begins to drain. You may notice how often the mind returns to the same moments, a message that felt slightly different. A pause in conversation that now seems meaningful. A shift in tone that once felt small but now feels important. It starts to dissect everything. It asks questions like, when did this begin? What changed? Was there something I missed? And with each question, the mind believes it is getting closer to peace, but it is actually moving further away, because these questions are not leading to answers. They are feeding a cycle where the mind keeps trying to close something that has already been left open. There is a hidden assumption behind all of this. The belief that closure must come from the other person, that they must explain, clarify, or validate what happened for the pain to end. But this belief creates a quiet dependency. It places your peace in the hands of someone who has already stepped back. And that is where suffering deepens. Because now it is not just about missing them. It is about needing something from them in order to feel okay again. And when that need is not met, the mind reacts. It becomes louder. It becomes more insistent. It starts building stories, creating possibilities, trying to fill the silence with meaning. But silence does not always carry a hidden message. Sometimes silence is simply what it is. The difficulty is that the mind is not comfortable with that. It wants things to be explained, resolved, completed. It wants a sense of order, a sense of understanding. It wants to feel like nothing is left unfinished. But life does not always move that way. People do not always offer explanations. Conversations do not always reach a clear ending. Feelings do not always get expressed in a way that feels complete. And when this happens, the mind tries to take control. It tries to create closure by thinking more. But thinking is not the same as resolving. You can think about something endlessly and still feel unsettled. You can analyze every detail and still feel uncertain, because the mind is not actually looking for information. It is looking for relief, and it believes that relief will come through understanding. But peace does not come from understanding everything. It comes from releasing the need to understand everything. This is where the shift begins, not in finding the perfect answer, but in noticing the movement of the mind itself. Noticing how it keeps returning to the same questions. Noticing how it tightens around the need for explanation. Noticing how it resists the fact that the situation is already over in its current form. There is something powerful in this noticing, because it creates space. Instead of being inside the cycle, you begin to see it. You begin to realize that the suffering is not just coming from what happened, but from what the mind is doing with what happened. And slowly, something softens. The urgency to figure everything out begins to lose its intensity. The need to reach out, to ask, to clarify starts to feel less necessary. Not because the questions have been answered, but because the grip of those questions has weakened. This does not happen all at once. There will still be moments where the mind returns, moments where it wants to go back, to reopen, to search again. But each time you notice this, there is an opportunity to not follow, to let the question arise without needing to solve it, to let the memory appear without needing to analyze it, to let the silence exist without needing to fill it. This is where a different kind of peace begins to form. Not the peace that comes from resolution, but the peace that comes from acceptance. Acceptance that not everything will be explained. Acceptance that not every connection will end clearly. Acceptance that some things will remain open, and that is okay. This kind of acceptance is not passive. It is not giving up or pretending not to care. It is a quiet strength, a willingness to stop forcing life to fit a certain shape, a willingness to let things be as they are, even when they feel incomplete. And in that willingness, something begins to return. Your attention. Instead of being pulled outward towards someone who has withdrawn, it begins to come back inward, back to your breath, your body, your present experience, back to what is actually here. Because while the mind has been chasing the past, life has continued moving. Moments have been passing, days have been unfolding, and much of it has been missed because attention was fixed on something that is no longer active. But now, with this shift, there is a chance to reconnect, to notice the small things again, the feeling of breathing, the quiet of a room, the simple presence of being here without needing to solve anything. And in this simplicity, there is relief. A relief that does not come from answers, but from rest, from no longer carrying the weight of unfinished conversations, from no longer trying to complete something that cannot be completed in the way the mind wants. This is where dignity quietly returns. Because chasing closure often leads to a loss of self-respect. It creates a dynamic where your peace depends on someone else's response. But when you stop chasing, something changes. You begin to stand on your own ground again. You begin to feel that your emotional state does not have to be negotiated through another person's behavior. That your peace is not something that needs to be granted. It is something that can be allowed. And this allowance is gentle. It does not force the pain to disappear. It does not rush the process. It simply creates space for things to settle naturally. The mind becomes less crowded. The The heart becomes less tense. The constant pull toward what is missing begins to loosen, and what remains is a quieter experience, one where thoughts still come, but they do not take over. One where feelings still arise, but they do not control everything. One where the absence of closure is no longer seen as a problem that must be fixed, but as a part of life that can be held without resistance. This is the beginning of inner peace, not because everything has been resolved, but because the need for resolution has softened. And in that softening, something deeper becomes possible, a different relationship with your own mind, one that is not based on control, but on awareness, one that does not demand answers, but allows uncertainty, one that no longer chases what has already moved away. And slowly, gently, this becomes enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to breathe again without tension, enough to sit without the constant need to figure things out, enough to live without being pulled back into the same loop. And as this continues, something becomes clear. Closure was never something they had to give. It was something the mind had to release. And as that quiet realization settles in, something else begins to surface. Even after the need for closure softens, the mind does not immediately rest. It finds a new place to hold on to. It turns its attention to what is no longer there. The absence. What used to feel normal now feels heavy. What used to be simple now feels distant. And without noticing it, the mind begins to give more power to what is missing than it ever gave to what was present. This is where the next layer of suffering begins. Something feels louder, even though nothing is being said. Silence starts to echo in ways that feel almost physical. A delayed reply feels like a statement. A shorter message feels like a shift. A lack of presence begins to feel like a message that must be decoded. And before long, absence becomes the center of attention. It starts small. A moment of checking your phone. A brief thought wondering why they have not reached out. A quiet pause that feels slightly longer than usual. But the mind does not leave it there. It begins to expand it. It stretches that small moment into something larger. It builds meaning around it. It turns a simple absence into something personal. This is how absence becomes louder than presence. Not because it is actually louder, but because the mind is giving it more attention, more importance, more interpretation. There is something important to notice here. When someone is present, the mind often relaxes. It does not question every word, every tone, every pause. It simply experiences the moment as it unfolds. But when someone becomes distant, the mind does the opposite. It becomes alert. It starts observing everything. It listens for what is not being said. It watches for what is not being done. It searches for patterns in what is missing. And this heightened attention creates intensity. Now, every small absence feels amplified. A message that comes hours later instead of minutes feels significant. A response that feels slightly different feels meaningful. Even silence itself begins to feel like communication. But silence is not always a message. Sometimes it is just silence. The difficulty is that the mind does not accept that easily. It prefers to fill the space. It creates explanations. It forms conclusions. It imagines possibilities. It tries to make sense of what it cannot directly understand. And in doing so, it creates an emotional storm. A storm that is not coming from what is happening externally, but from how the mind is interpreting what is happening. This is where awareness becomes important. Not awareness of the other person, but awareness of your own inner movement. Noticing how quickly the mind jumps from observation to conclusion. Noticing how it turns a delayed reply into a story. Noticing how it takes silence and fills it with meaning. This noticing is not meant to stop the thoughts, it is meant to reveal them. Because once you begin to see how the mind is operating, something shifts. The thoughts lose a bit of their authority. They are no longer seen as truth, but as activity, and this creates space. Instead of immediately believing every interpretation, there is a a moment where you can see the difference between what is actually happening and what the mind is adding. What is actually happening is simple. There is distance, there is silence, there is a change in interaction, but what the mind adds is complex. It adds meaning, it adds intention, it adds emotional weight. And this addition is what creates suffering. Because now you are not just experiencing absence, you are experiencing a story about absence. A story that often leads to anxiety, confusion, and self-doubt. But here is where a deeper understanding begins. The mind is not trying to hurt you, it is trying to protect you. It believes that by analyzing the situation, it can prevent future pain. It believes that by understanding what is happening, it can regain control. But in reality, this constant analysis creates more instability, because it keeps you focused on something that is not within your control, the other person's behavior, their timing, their level of attention, their emotional state. All of these things are outside of you, and yet the mind keeps returning to them, trying to find certainty in something that is constantly changing. This is where the practice of letting go becomes essential. Not letting go of caring, but letting go of over-monitoring. Not letting go of connection, but letting go of obsession. Not letting go of feeling, but letting go of constant interpretation. Because the more you observe absence without adding meaning to it, the quieter the experience becomes. Silence becomes just silence. Distance becomes just distance. It no longer carries the same emotional weight. This does not mean that the situation suddenly feels pleasant. There may still be discomfort, there may still be a sense of loss, but it is no longer amplified by the mind's constant activity, and this makes a difference, because the intensity of the experience is reduced. The emotional storm begins to calm, and within that calm, something else becomes possible, a return to presence. Instead of being pulled into what is missing, your attention begins to rest in what is here, your breath, your body, the space around you, the simple experience of being alive in this moment. This may seem small, but it is powerful, because it shifts the center of your experience from absence to presence, from what is not happening to what is happening. And in this shift, the mind begins to settle. It no longer needs to chase every thought. It no longer needs to analyze every silence. It begins to trust that not everything requires interpretation, that not everything is a hidden message, that sometimes things are exactly what they appear to be. And this simplicity brings relief, a quiet relief that does not depend on the other person returning, a steady relief that comes from no longer being consumed by what is missing. This is where a deeper kind of freedom begins. The freedom to experience absence without being overwhelmed by it. The freedom to allow distance without turning it into a personal judgment. The freedom to sit with silence without needing to fill it. And this freedom is subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. It appears quietly in moments where the mind does not react as strongly as it used to. In moments where a delayed reply does not create anxiety. In moments where silence does not immediately lead to overthinking. These moments may feel small, but they are significant. They show that something is changing, that the mind is learning to relate differently to absence, that it is no longer treating what is missing as something that must be solved, but as something that can be experienced without resistance. And as this continues, the relationship with absence transforms. It is no longer something to fear. It is no longer something to analyze. It becomes something neutral, something that simply exists without needing to be interpreted. And in this neutrality, there is peace. A peace that is not dependent on presence. A peace that does not disappear when someone pulls away. A peace that remains steady even when things change. This is the gift of awareness. It does not change what is happening externally, but it changes how you experience it internally. And that change is enough to reduce suffering, enough to bring clarity, enough to allow you to move through the experience without being consumed by it. So as you continue, remember this. Absence is not louder than presence. The mind is simply paying more attention to it. And when that attention softens, the noise begins to fade. And what remains is something much quieter, something much steadier, something that was always there, waiting beneath the surface. Your own inner peace. And as that quiet space begins to settle, another truth slowly comes into view. Even when the mind stops chasing silence and stops giving power to absence, there is still something deeper holding the pain in place. It is not just the distance. It is the expectation that things were supposed to stay the same. Something inside resists change. It holds on to how the connection once felt, how the energy once flowed, how the presence once came naturally, and without noticing it, the heart begins comparing what is happening now to what used to be. That comparison is where the next layer of suffering begins. Something feels off, not because everything has disappeared, but because it is no longer consistent. The warmth that once felt steady now feels uncertain. The attention that once came easily now feels delayed. The connection that once felt predictable now feels unstable. And the heart does not like this. It wants continuity. It wants the same level of care, the same tone, the same rhythm, the same emotional availability. It wants the connection to remain fixed, unchanged, dependable in the exact way it once was. But human connection does not work like that. Emotions shift, attention moves, people change, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. And yet, the heart continues to expect stability, as if feelings should remain constant once they are established. This expectation creates tension, because reality is moving, but the heart is holding still. And in that gap, discomfort grows. You may notice how the mind keeps returning to the past, not to analyze what went wrong this time, but to remember how things used to feel. It recalls moments of closeness, moments of ease, moments where everything felt aligned. It uses those memories as a reference point. And then it looks at the present and feels the difference. That difference becomes painful, not because the present is necessarily bad, but because it does not match what once existed. This is where attachment to emotional continuity reveals itself. It is not just attachment to the person, but attachment to a version of them. A version that felt consistent, reliable, and familiar. And when that version begins to fade, the heart reacts. It tries to restore it, it tries to recreate it, it tries to bring things back to how they were. But this effort creates exhaustion, because it is an attempt to hold something that is already changing. There is something important to understand here. The heart is not wrong for wanting stability. It is natural to feel safe when things are consistent. It is natural to feel comfortable when emotional patterns are predictable. It is natural to want connection to remain steady. But suffering begins when this natural desire becomes a rigid expectation. When the heart believes that consistency must continue. When it assumes that once something feels a certain way, it should always feel that way. This belief creates resistance, resistance to change, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to the natural movement of human experience. And this resistance is what turns change into pain. Because instead of allowing the connection to evolve, the mind tries to fix it in place. It holds on to past moments and uses them as a standard. It says, "This is how it should feel." And anything that does not match that standard begins to feel wrong. This is where a deeper shift becomes possible, not by forcing the heart to stop caring, but by gently loosening the expectation that things must remain the same, by seeing that emotional continuity is not guaranteed, that feelings are not fixed, that people are not static. They move through different states, different priorities, different inner experiences. And sometimes those movements create distance, not always because something is wrong, but because change is part of being human. When this is understood, something begins to soften. The pressure to maintain a certain version of the connection begins to ease. The need to compare the present to the past begins to weaken, and the heart starts to open to a different way of relating, a way that does not depend on consistency, a way that allows fluctuation, a way that accepts that connection can change without it meaning something has been lost permanently. This does not mean that everything is suddenly comfortable. There may still be moments of longing, moments where the memory of how things used to feel arises. But these moments no longer carry the same weight. They are seen as memories, not expectations. They are felt, but not clung to. And this changes the experience. Instead of trying to bring the past into the present, there is a willingness to meet the present as it is, without forcing it to match something else, without demanding it to return to a previous state. This creates a sense of ease, a quiet ease that does not come from control, but from acceptance. Acceptance that emotional continuity is not something that can be secured. It is something that naturally shifts. And when the heart stops trying to hold it in place, it begins to experience something else. Freedom. The freedom to feel without needing things to stay the same. The freedom to care without needing constant reassurance. The freedom to remain steady even when the connection is not. This steadiness is not based on the other person. It is based on your own presence, your ability to remain grounded within yourself, regardless of how the external situation changes. And this is where inner peace begins to deepen, not because everything is stable, but because you are no longer depending on stability to feel okay. You begin to see that the discomfort was not coming from change itself. It was coming from the expectation that change should not happen. And once that expectation softens, the experience of change becomes less threatening. It becomes something that can be observed rather than resisted, something that can be allowed rather than controlled. This shift is subtle but powerful because it removes the constant tension between what is and what should be. It allows the heart to rest in the present moment without comparing it to something else, to rest without needing to recreate the past, to rest without fearing the future. And in that rest, something becomes clear. Connection does not need to be constant to be meaningful. It does not need to remain the same to have value. It can change, it can fluctuate, it can even fade and still have been real. This understanding brings a different kind of peace. A peace that is not tied to continuity, a peace that is not shaken by change, a peace that allows the heart to remain open without becoming attached to a fixed outcome. And as this continues, the relationship with connection transforms. It is no longer about holding on to how things were. It becomes about being present with how things are, without resistance, without expectation, without fear. And in this presence, there is a quiet strength, a strength that does not depend on emotional consistency, a strength that remains steady even as everything around it shifts. This is the deeper lesson. That inner peace is not found in keeping things the same. It is found in allowing things to change without losing yourself in the process. And when this is truly seen, something relaxes. The grip loosens, the heart softens, and the need for emotional continuity quietly fades. What remains is something much more stable, not the connection itself, but your ability to remain at peace within it, no matter how it changes. And as that grip on continuity begins to loosen, another layer quietly reveals itself. Even when you stop expecting things to stay the same, the mind still tries to explain why they changed. It looks at the distance, at the silence, at the shift in energy, and it does something very subtle. It makes it personal. A quiet thought appears, almost unnoticed at first, but deeply felt. It says something must be wrong with me. And from that moment, the experience of distance transforms into something heavier. Not just change, not just absence, but rejection. There is a moment where everything feels fine, and then suddenly, something feels different. The tone shifts, the energy drops, the presence fades, and before there is any real understanding of what is happening, the mind rushes in to explain it. But it does not explain it neutrally. It explains it through identity. It begins to ask questions that point inward in a painful way. Did I say too much? Was I not enough? Did I do something wrong? Am I being replaced? And without realizing it, the mind turns another person's movement into a judgment about your worth. This is how the illusion forms. Distance becomes rejection, silence becomes disapproval, change becomes proof that something about you is lacking. But this is not what is actually happening. It only feels that way because the mind is interpreting events through a very old pattern. A pattern that links external behavior to internal value. This pattern is deeply conditioned. From early experiences, many people learn to associate attention with worth. When someone is present, it feels like validation. When someone withdraws, it feels like something has been taken away. And because of this, the mind reacts quickly. It does not pause to consider all possibilities. It goes straight to self-reference. It assumes that the change must be about you. But human behavior is far more complex than that. People pull away for many reasons that have nothing to do with the person they are pulling away from. They may be overwhelmed, distracted, uncertain, dealing with their own inner struggles, or simply changing direction in their life. These movements are part of their own experience, but the mind does not always see that. It collapses all of that complexity into a single conclusion. I am the reason, and this conclusion creates suffering. Because now, the pain is not just about distance, it is about identity. It feels like something about you has been diminished. And once that belief takes hold, the mind begins to look for evidence. It replays conversations, searching for mistakes. It analyzes interactions, looking for signs of failure. It builds a narrative where everything points back to a perceived flaw. And this narrative feels convincing, not because it is true, but because it is repeated. This is where awareness becomes essential again. Not to stop the thoughts, but to question their foundation. To see that the mind is making a leap from observation to identity, from noticing distance to concluding rejection, from experiencing change to assuming personal inadequacy. When this leap is seen clearly, something begins to shift. The certainty of the thought weakens. Instead of immediately believing, there is space to observe. To ask quietly, is this really about me? Or is the mind simply trying to create a story? This question does not need an immediate answer. It simply interrupts the automatic pattern. And in that interruption, something softens. The emotional intensity begins to reduce. The tightness around self-worth begins to loosen. Because now, the situation is no longer being experienced as a personal verdict. It is being seen as an event. Something that is happening, not something that defines you. This distinction is subtle but powerful. It separates what is external from what is internal. It allows you to experience another person's behavior without absorbing it into your identity. And this is where a deeper form of peace begins to emerge. Not a peace that depends on how others behave, but a peace that remains steady regardless of external changes. Because your worth is no longer being measured by someone else's presence. It is no longer rising when they come closer and falling when they step away. It remains stable. Not because nothing is happening, but because you are no longer tying your value to what is happening. This stability changes everything. It allows you to experience distance without collapsing into self-doubt. It allows you to feel the shift without turning it into a judgment. It allows you to remain grounded, even when the situation is unclear. This does not mean that the experience becomes pleasant. There may still be discomfort, there may still be questions, but the core of your identity is no longer shaken. And this makes the experience much lighter, because the weight of self-judgment is no longer present. There is something else that begins to change as well. the way you see the other person. Instead of seeing them as someone who has rejected you, you begin to see them as someone moving through their own experience, someone whose actions are influenced by their own thoughts, emotions, and circumstances, someone whose behavior is not a direct reflection of your value, but a reflection of their current state. This shift creates compassion, not in a forced way, but in a natural way. Because when you stop taking everything personally, you begin to see things more clearly. You see that people act from where they are, not from who you are. And this understanding reduces the need to interpret everything as a personal statement. It allows you to step back, to observe, to remain present without being pulled into a story. And in that presence, something stabilizes. Your sense of self. It becomes less reactive, less dependent, less fragile, because it is no longer built on external validation. It is rooted internally, in your own awareness, in your own presence, in your own understanding of who you are, independent of how others behave. This is not something that happens instantly. It develops gradually, through moments of noticing, moments of pausing before believing, moments of choosing not to turn distance into rejection. Each of these moments strengthens a different way of relating, a way that is not based on assumption, but on awareness, a way that does not rush to conclusions, but allows space, a way that does not collapse into self-doubt, but remains steady. And as this continues, the illusion begins to dissolve. Distance is no longer automatically interpreted as rejection. It is seen as distance, nothing more, nothing less. This simplicity brings relief, because it removes the extra layer of suffering, the layer that was created by interpretation, the layer that was built on assumption, the layer that turned an external event into an internal wound. Without that layer, the experience becomes clearer, more direct, less heavy, and within that clarity there is space. Space to breathe, space to feel without over-identifying, space to remain connected to yourself, even when someone else disconnects. This is the deeper teaching, that your identity is not something that can be confirmed or denied by another person's behavior. It exists independently. It remains intact, regardless of who stays and who leaves. And when this is truly understood, something settles. The need to prove your worth fades. The fear of being rejected softens. The urge to interpret every change as a personal failure disappears. What remains is something much quieter, a steady sense of self that does not need constant validation, a calm presence that does not react to every shift, a quiet confidence that remains, even in uncertainty. And from this place, relationships are experienced differently, not as a source of identity, but as a part of life that can change without defining you. This is where freedom begins to deepen, not because others stop pulling away, but because their movement no longer determines your sense of self. And in that freedom, there is peace. A peace that does not depend on being chosen. A peace that does not collapse when someone leaves. A peace that remains quietly, steadily within you. And as that quiet stability begins to take root, something else slowly becomes visible. Even when you stop taking the distance personally, even when you stop turning it into rejection, the mind still has one more place it likes to return to: the past. Not the whole past, but very specific moments. A sentence that felt slightly different. A pause that now feels important. A message that seems like it carried more meaning than you noticed at the time. And without realizing it, the mind begins to rehearse. It starts going back again and again, not to relive the moment, but to correct it, to understand it, to find something hidden inside it that will finally bring peace. And this is where a different kind of exhaustion begins. There is a quiet habit that forms when someone pulls away. The mind does not stay in the present. It drifts backward. It replays conversations, not once, but repeatedly, as if each repetition might reveal something new. A message is read again, but now with a different tone. A memory is recalled, but now with a different interpretation. A moment that once felt simple is now filled with meaning, and the mind believes it is getting closer to clarity. But what it is actually doing is reinforcing a loop, because the past does not change. No matter how many times you revisit it, it remains exactly as it was. The words do not shift, the tone does not update, the moment does not offer new information, only the interpretation changes. And each time the interpretation changes, the mind feels like it is discovering something important. But this discovery does not lead to peace. It leads to more thinking, because now there is a new angle, a new possibility, a new question, and the cycle continues. This is how the mind becomes trapped in rehearsal. It is not trying to suffer, it is trying to solve. It believes that if it can just understand the past perfectly, the present will finally feel settled. But this belief creates tension, because it places peace in a place that cannot be accessed. The past is not available for resolution. It is only available for memory. And memory, when constantly revisited with the intention of solving, becomes heavy. You may notice how certain moments feel almost vivid. A conversation that replays clearly in your mind. A tone that feels sharper now than it did before. A silence that seems louder in memory than it ever was in reality. This vividness is not because the moment has changed. It is because attention has intensified. The more the mind returns to something, the more detailed it becomes. The more important it feels, the more real it seems. And this creates a strange experience. The past begins to feel more alive than the present. And when that happens, the present begins to fade. You may find yourself sitting in a quiet space, but your attention is somewhere else. You are not experiencing what is in front of you. You are inside a conversation that has already ended. And this creates disconnection, not from the other person, but from your own life. Because while the mind is busy revisiting what has already happened, the present moment is passing unnoticed. This is where stillness begins to lose its presence. Not because it is not there, but because attention is elsewhere. And this is why letting go of mental rehearsal is not about forgetting. It is about returning. Returning to what is happening now. Returning to your breath, your body, your immediate experience. But the mind resists this. It says, I cannot let this go yet. There is something I still need to understand. And this resistance keeps the loop active, because the mind believes that letting go means missing something important. But what if there is nothing left to find? What if the need to keep searching is what is creating the unrest? This is where a deeper shift begins, not by forcing the mind to stop thinking, but by seeing clearly what the thinking is doing. Seeing how each replay does not bring resolution, but prolongs the tension. Seeing how each analysis does not bring clarity, but creates more questions. Seeing how the effort to solve the past is what is preventing peace in the present. This seeing is quiet. It does not require force. It simply requires attention. Attention that observes the movement of the mind without immediately following it. When a memory arises, it is noticed. When a conversation begins to replay, it is seen. But instead of entering it, there is a pause, a gentle recognition that this has already happened, that this does not need to be solved again. And in that recognition, something softens. The intensity of the replay reduces, the urge to continue weakens, and slowly, the mind begins to release its grip. This does not mean that thoughts disappear completely. They may still arise, but they no longer take over in the same way. They pass through more lightly. They are seen as memories, not problems, and this changes the experience. Because now, the past is no longer something that demands attention. It becomes something that can exist without controlling the present. This creates space, a space that was previously filled with repetition, a space where stillness can begin to appear again. Stillness is not something that needs to be created. It is something that becomes visible when the mind is no longer constantly moving. When the rehearsals stop, even briefly, there is a gap. And in that gap, there is quiet. A quiet that feels unfamiliar at first, because the mind is used to activity. But this quiet is not empty. It is steady. It is calm. It is free from the tension of needing to solve something. And as this quiet becomes more familiar, something changes in how you relate to your thoughts. You begin to trust that not every thought needs to be followed, that not every memory needs to be analyzed, that not every moment needs to be understood. This trust reduces the urgency. The mind becomes less reactive, less driven to return to the past, and more able to remain present. This presence is not forced, it is natural. It arises when there is nothing pulling attention away. And in this presence, something important happens. You begin to feel again, not the past, but what is here. The sensation of breathing, the feeling of your body sitting or lying down, the quiet environment around you. These simple experiences may seem small, but they are grounding. They bring you back to reality. Not the constructed reality of thoughts, but the direct experience of life as it is happening now. And this grounding creates stability. A stability that is not dependent on understanding everything. A stability that is not shaken by unanswered questions. A stability that comes from being here fully without needing to go back. This is where the deeper peace begins. Not because the past has been resolved, but because it is no longer being constantly revisited. Not because everything makes sense, but because the need to make sense of everything has softened. And in that softening, the mind begins to rest. It no longer feels the need to work constantly. It no longer feels the need to search endlessly. It begins to settle into a quieter rhythm, a rhythm that is not driven by urgency, but by presence. And as this continues, something becomes clear. The past does not need to be solved for peace to exist. It only needs to be allowed to remain where it is. And when the mind stops trying to bring it into the present again and again, the present becomes lighter, more open, more available. And in that openness, there is space for something new. Not answers, not conclusions, but a different experience. An experience where you are no longer trapped in repetition, where you are no longer rehearsing what has already ended, where you are simply here without needing to fix anything. And this simplicity is enough. Enough to feel calm, enough to feel grounded, enough to move forward without carrying the weight of constant replay. This is the quiet shift. From solving to allowing, from rehearsing to resting, from being caught in the past to being present with what is here. And in that shift, stillness begins to return. And as that stillness begins to return, another pattern slowly reveals itself. Even when the mind stops replaying the past, even when it begins to rest in the present, there can still be a quiet pull that has not yet been released. It is not a thought this time. It is a desire, a subtle urge to be chosen again. Something inside does not want to accept the distance as it is. It wants to reverse it. It wants to restore what was lost. It wants to feel wanted again, seen again, pursued again. And without noticing it, the heart begins to reach. There is a quiet ache that does not always speak in words. It shows up as a need to be acknowledged, a hope that they will come back, a longing for a message that carries warmth again. And beneath all of that, there is a simple wish. Choose me. Not directly, not always consciously, but it is there. A desire to be valued in the same way as before. A desire to feel important again in their eyes. A desire to be the one they return to. But when someone has already stepped back, this desire begins to move in a painful direction. Because now, instead of being freely given, attention becomes something hoped for, something waited for, something subtly chased. And this is where the emptiness begins. Not because wanting love is wrong, but because trying to pull it from a place that is no longer open creates tension. There is something deeply exhausting about trying to be chosen by someone who is no longer choosing. It may not always look obvious. It can appear as small actions, sending another message, adjusting your tone to seem less intense, holding back certain thoughts in the hope of being more appealing. Or it can appear internally, thinking about how to respond in a way that will bring them closer, wondering what version of yourself would make them return, questioning whether being more distant, more available, more understanding would change something. All of these movements come from the same place, an attempt to influence their choice. But this attempt slowly disconnects you from yourself, because now your attention is no longer resting in your own experience. It is focused outward, focused on their reactions, focused on how to create a response, focused on how to become someone who is chosen again. And this creates a subtle loss of dignity, not in a harsh or judgmental way, but in a quiet, almost invisible way. Because dignity is not about controlling others. It is about remaining aligned with yourself. And when your sense of worth begins to depend on whether someone returns, that alignment starts to shift. You begin to move away from your own center. You begin to shape yourself around someone else's attention. And this creates emptiness, because no matter how much you adjust, you cannot control another person's willingness. You cannot make someone feel something they are no longer feeling. You cannot create desire where there is distance. And the more you try, the more you feel the gap. A gap between effort and response. A gap between giving and receiving. A gap that becomes more noticeable with every attempt. This gap is where suffering deepens. Because now it is not just about the absence of connection. It is about the effort to restore it. An effort that does not bring the result you hope for. And this creates a feeling of rejection, not just from them, but from the situation itself. A feeling that no matter what you do, it is not enough. But here is where a different understanding begins. The emptiness is not coming from their distance. It is coming from the attempt to fill that distance through force. Force does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks like over-effort. Sometimes it looks like over-giving. Sometimes it looks like trying to be everything at once, hoping something will bring them back. But love does not respond to force. It responds to openness. And when openness is no longer present on both sides, trying to recreate it through effort leads to exhaustion. This is where letting go becomes necessary. Not letting go of caring, but letting go of trying to be chosen. Letting go of shaping yourself to fit someone else's changing attention. Letting go of the quiet hope that one more action will change everything. This letting go is not immediate. It happens gradually, through moments of noticing when the mind starts planning how to regain their attention. Noticing when the heart starts reaching outward instead of resting inward. Noticing when your energy begins to depend on their response. Each time this is noticed, there is an opportunity. An opportunity to pause, to stop the movement, to return to yourself. This return is simple. It is not about rejecting them. It is about reconnecting with your own presence, your breath, your body, your own sense of being. And in this return, something shifts. The urgency reduces. The need to act fades. The desire to be chosen softens. Not because the feeling disappears completely, but because it is no longer driving your behavior. And as this continues, dignity begins to return, not as an idea, but as a feeling of being grounded within yourself, a feeling of not needing to prove your worth, a feeling of not needing to earn attention. This dignity is quiet. It does not demand. It does not chase. It does not try to convince. It simply remains. And in that stillness, something becomes clear. Love cannot be taken from closed hands. It cannot be negotiated into existence. It cannot be created through effort alone. It either flows or it does not. And when it does not, the most peaceful response is not to force it. It is to step back, not in anger, not in pride, but in understanding. Understanding that your energy does not need to be spent where it is not received. Understanding that your presence does not need to be shaped to fit someone else's distance. Understanding that your worth is not defined by whether someone chooses you. This understanding creates space. A space where your attention is no longer tied to their behavior. A space where your emotional state is no longer dependent on their response. A space where you can exist without needing to be chosen. And in this space, something deeper begins to grow. Self-respect. Not the kind that is built on comparison or validation, but the kind that comes from alignment, from being true to yourself, regardless of what is happening externally. And this self-respect changes how you experience the situation. The need to reach reduces, the need to fix disappears. The need to be seen by them becomes less important than being present with yourself. And this shift is powerful because it removes the pressure to perform, the pressure to maintain connection, the pressure to be enough in someone else's eyes. Without that pressure, the heart begins to relax. It no longer feels like it has to earn something. It no longer feels like it has to prove something. It begins to rest. And in that rest, there is peace, not because the situation has changed, but because your relationship to it has changed. You are no longer trying to be chosen. You are allowing yourself to be, and that is enough. Enough to feel whole, enough to feel steady, enough to move forward without carrying the weight of unmet expectation. This is where true freedom begins. Not in being selected by someone else, but in no longer needing that selection to feel complete. And from this place, something becomes possible again. Not the return of the past, but the opening of something new. A life that is not centered around being chosen, but around being present. A life that is not shaped by someone else's distance, but by your own inner stability. And in that life there is a quiet strength, a strength that does not reach, a strength that does not force, a strength that simply remains, and in that remaining, dignity is fully restored. And as that quiet dignity begins to return, something deeper starts to surface. Even when the urge to be chosen softens, even when the need to chase fades, there can still be a subtle discomfort that lingers beneath the surface. It is not about them anymore. It is about how it feels. A quiet sting appears, not always loud, but very real. A sense that something about this situation touches your pride in a way that is hard to ignore. It feels like being overlooked. It feels like being set aside. And without noticing it, the experience shifts again. Not into longing this time, but into something more subtle, a feeling of being diminished. Something inside tightens when distance happens, not just because of the loss, but because of what it seems to say. It begins to feel like a quiet form of disrespect, even if no words were spoken. The mind may not say it directly, but the feeling is clear. Why would they pull away from me? And behind that question, there is something deeper, a belief that this should not have happened, because somewhere within there is an expectation to be valued, to be preferred, to be someone who is not easily let go. This expectation is not always conscious, but it is powerful. It is rooted in identity, the identity of being important in someone's life, the identity of being chosen without question. And when distance appears, this identity feels challenged. This is where the ego begins to react, not loudly, not aggressively, but in a very quiet and internal way. It takes the situation and turns it into something personal. Not just about connection, but about status. It begins to interpret the withdrawal as a loss of position, a loss of significance, and this creates a different kind of pain, not just emotional, but psychological, because now it is not only about missing someone, it is about feeling less than. This is how the ego transforms distance into humiliation. not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle one, a quiet feeling that something about you has been lowered. And this feeling is uncomfortable, because the ego is not designed to accept this easily. It wants to protect its image. It wants to maintain its sense of importance. It wants to remain in a position where it feels valued. And when that is disrupted, it reacts. Sometimes it reacts by trying to regain attention. Sometimes it reacts by pulling back and creating distance in return. Sometimes it reacts by creating stories that protect its pride. They are not worth it anyway. They lost someone valuable. They will regret this. These thoughts are not random. They are attempts to restore balance, to bring the sense of importance back. But beneath these thoughts, there is still a feeling. A feeling that something about this situation has touched a sensitive place. A place that does not want to feel small. This is where awareness becomes important again. Not to judge the ego, but to understand it. To see that the reaction is not about truth, but about protection. The ego is trying to maintain a certain image. An image of being someone who is always valued, always wanted, always chosen. But life does not always reflect that image. People change, situations shift, connections evolve, and sometimes someone steps away. Not because you are less, but because their path is moving differently. But the ego does not see this clearly. It interprets everything through identity, through the lens of, what does this say about me? And this interpretation creates suffering, because it ties your sense of self to something external, something that is not stable, something that can change at any moment. This is where Buddhist practice offers a different perspective. It invites you to look at the ego not as something to fight, but as something to observe, to notice how it reacts, to notice how it interprets, to notice how it creates a sense of self based on conditions that are always changing. And in this noticing, something begins to soften. The reaction loses its intensity. The need to protect the image reduces. The sense of humiliation begins to dissolve, because you start to see that the feeling is not coming from what happened. It is coming from how it is being interpreted, from the belief that your value has been affected. But value is not something that is given or taken away by another person's behavior. It is not something that increases when someone stays or decreases when someone leaves. It is not something that needs to be confirmed externally. It exists independently, and when this is understood, something changes. The ego begins to relax, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer driving the experience. The need to feel preferred becomes less urgent. The need to be important in someone else's eyes becomes less dominant. The need to maintain a certain image begins to fade. And in that fading, there is relief. A relief that comes from no longer needing to prove anything, no longer needing to hold a position, no longer needing to interpret every change as a threat to identity. This relief creates space. A space where you can experience the situation without adding extra meaning, without turning it into something about your worth, without turning it into something about your importance. It becomes simpler. Someone moved away. That is all. No additional layer, no personal judgment, no hidden message about who you are. And in this simplicity, there is peace. A peace that is not fragile, a peace that does not depend on being valued by others, a peace that remains steady, regardless of how others behave. This steadiness is quiet. It does not seek attention. It does not demand recognition. It simply exists. And from this place, something else becomes possible. A different way of relating to yourself. One that is not based on comparison. One that is not based on validation. One that is not based on being chosen, but on being present, being aware, being grounded. And this way of relating changes everything, because now your sense of self is not something that fluctuates with external events. It is something that remains stable, something that is not affected by who stays or who leaves, something that is not shaken by distance. And as this stability grows, the ego's reactions become less intense. They may still arise, but they are seen more clearly. They are not followed as easily. They are not believed as strongly. They pass more quickly. And in their place, there is a different feeling, not pride, not humiliation, but neutrality. A simple acceptance of what is, without needing to elevate or diminish yourself in response. This neutrality is powerful because it removes the extremes, the need to feel superior, the fear of feeling inferior. Both begin to dissolve, and what remains is balance, a balanced sense of self that does not swing with circumstances, a grounded presence that does not react to every shift, a quiet confidence that is not dependent on being preferred. And from this place, relationships are experienced differently, not as a reflection of your worth, but as interactions that can change without defining you. This creates freedom. The freedom to connect without attachment to status. The freedom to care without needing to be important. The freedom to remain steady, even when things shift. And in this freedom, there is peace. A peace that does not need to be protected. A peace that does not need to be defended. A peace that simply remains quietly within you. And as this continues, something becomes clear. The ego was never the problem. It was simply trying to protect something that did not need protection. And once that is seen, the need to take distance personally begins to fade. What remains is something much lighter. A sense of self that is not tied to being chosen, a presence that is not affected by withdrawal, a quiet understanding that who you are is not defined by how others move, and in that understanding there is a deep and lasting calm, a calm that does not react, a calm that does not chase, a calm that simply allows, and in that allowing, peace becomes natural again. And as that calm begins to settle more deeply, another pattern quietly comes into view. Even when the ego softens, even when the need to feel important begins to fade, there is still a subtle tension that can remain inside the heart. It is not loud, it is not obvious, but it is urgent. A quiet pressure builds, almost like something inside cannot wait. It wants clarity, it wants certainty. It wants to know what is happening, and it wants to know now. And beneath that urgency, there is something that is rarely seen, a form of inner force. There is a certain kind of discomfort that feels sharper than the rest. It is not just confusion, and it is not just longing. It is the feeling that not knowing is unbearable. Something inside begins to push. It wants answers quickly. It wants explanations without delay. It wants the situation to make sense immediately, without space, without uncertainty, without time. And when that does not happen, tension rises. The body tightens, the mind speeds up, the emotions become heavier. This is where urgency begins to take control. It may not appear aggressive, but it carries a kind of force. A force that says, this needs to be resolved right now. A force that does not allow space for things to unfold naturally. A force that treats uncertainty as something dangerous. This is what can be called hidden violence. Not violence directed outward, but directed inward. A pressure placed on your own mind and heart. A demand that things must be clear. A demand that emotions must settle immediately. A demand that confusion must disappear. And when these demands are not met, the inner experience becomes strained. Because the heart is not being allowed to process naturally. It is being pushed. Pushed to understand faster. Pushed to feel differently. Pushed to reach a conclusion before it is ready. This pushing creates agitation. The mind becomes restless. It jumps from one thought to another, searching for something that will bring relief. But relief does not come from speed. It comes from space. And when space is not allowed, the search becomes exhausting. You may notice how the mind tries to fill every gap. If there is silence, it creates meaning. If there is delay, it creates interpretation. If there is uncertainty, it creates conclusions. All of this happens quickly, almost instantly, because the mind is trying to escape the discomfort of not knowing. But in doing so, it creates more discomfort, because the conclusions it forms are not always accurate. They are shaped by fear, by past experiences, by the need for certainty. And this leads to more confusion, more questioning, more urgency. This is the cycle. A cycle driven not by what is happening externally, but by the internal demand for immediate resolution. And this demand is what needs to be understood, not judged, not suppressed, but seen clearly. Seen as a reaction to discomfort. Seen as an attempt to regain control. Seen as a habit that has been learned over time. Because many people are not comfortable with uncertainty. They have been taught to solve problems quickly, to find answers, to make sense of things. And while this can be useful in many areas of life, it becomes harmful when applied to emotional experience. Because emotions do not follow logic, they do not resolve instantly. They do not provide clear answers on demand. They move slowly, they shift, they require space. And when that space is not given, they become intensified. This is why urgency creates suffering, not because wanting clarity is wrong, but because demanding it immediately disrupts the natural process of understanding. This is where a different approach begins, not by forcing the mind to stop wanting answers, but by softening the demand for immediacy, by allowing questions to exist without needing instant answers, by allowing uncertainty to be present without treating it as a threat. This is not easy at first, because the mind is used to movement, used to searching, used to resolving. So when it is asked to pause, it resists. It tries to continue the search. It tries to find something to hold on to. But if you stay with the pause, something begins to change. The intensity of the urgency starts to decrease. The pressure begins to soften. The need to know right now becomes less dominant. And in that softening, something else appears. Patience. Not forced patience, but natural patience. A patience that allows things to unfold. A patience that does not rush the process. A patience that trusts that clarity will come in its own time. This patience creates space. A space where the mind does not feel pressured. A space where the heart does not feel pushed. A space where uncertainty can exist without causing distress. And in this space, understanding begins to develop differently, not through force, but through observation, not through urgency, but through presence. You begin to notice things more clearly, not because you are searching harder, but because you are no longer clouded by pressure. The situation becomes easier to see, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle one. Details that were missed before become visible. Patterns that were unclear begin to make sense. But this clarity does not come from trying to control the process, it comes from allowing it. This is the paradox. The more you demand answers, the more confused you become. The more you allow space, the clearer things become. And this shift changes your relationship with uncertainty. It is no longer something to escape. It becomes something that can be experienced, something that can be held without resistance, something that does not need to be solved immediately. And in this new relationship, there is peace. A peace that does not depend on having all the answers. A peace that remains even when things are unclear. A peace that allows you to continue living even without resolution. This peace is steady. It does not fluctuate with every thought. It does not disappear when a question arises. It remains quietly beneath the surface. And as this peace deepens, something else changes. Your response to situations, you become less reactive, less driven by urgency, less controlled by the need for immediate clarity. You begin to move differently, more slowly, more intentionally, more calmly. And this changes how you experience everything, not just this situation, but all situations. Because the habit of urgency is not limited to one area. It affects how you think, how you feel, how you respond, and when that habit is softened, everything becomes lighter, the mind becomes less crowded, the heart becomes less tense, the overall experience becomes more peaceful. This is the deeper teaching. That urgency is not just a reaction, it is a form of inner pressure, a pressure that can be released. And when it is released, something opens, a sense of ease, a sense of trust, a sense of being able to move through uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. This ease is not dramatic, it is quiet. It shows up in moments where you would have reacted before, but now you pause. It shows up in moments where you would have searched for answers, but now you allow the question to remain. It shows up in moments where you would have felt overwhelmed, but now you feel steady. These moments may seem small, but they are significant. They show that something is changing, that the need for immediate answers is losing its grip, that the mind is learning to rest, even in uncertainty. And as this continues, something becomes clear. You do not need to know everything right now to feel at peace. You do not need to solve every question to feel calm. You do not need to force clarity to experience stillness. Peace is not the result of having all the answers. It is the result of not demanding them immediately. And when this is truly understood, something relaxes. The pressure disappears. The urgency fades. The hidden violence dissolves. What remains is something much gentler. A mind that allows, a heart that trusts, a presence that is not in a hurry. And in that presence, peace grows naturally. Not because everything is clear, but because nothing is being forced. And that is enough. And as that urgency begins to dissolve, something even more subtle begins to show itself. When the demand for immediate answers softens, the mind does not simply become empty. It looks for something else to hold on to. And when there is silence, it begins to create, not truth, stories. There is a quiet moment when nothing is being said, nothing is being explained, nothing is being confirmed. And instead of resting in that space, the mind begins to fill it. It starts gently at first, a small assumption, a passing thought. Maybe something changed. Maybe they feel different. Maybe something is wrong. But the mind does not leave it there. It builds, it adds layers, it connects small pieces and turns them into something larger. A delayed reply becomes a sign, a shorter message becomes a shift. A moment of distance becomes a pattern, and suddenly, what was once silence becomes a full narrative. This is how the mind creates stories, not because it is trying to deceive, but because it is uncomfortable with emptiness. Silence feels incomplete, uncertainty feels unstable, and the mind, in its attempt to create stability, fills the space with meaning. But the meaning it creates is not always grounded in reality. It is shaped by fear, by memory, by past experiences, and most of all, by the need to explain what cannot yet be explained. This is where overthinking begins to take a different form. It is no longer just searching for answers, it is constructing scenarios. You may notice how quickly the mind moves from not knowing to imagining. It does not stay in the unknown, it replaces it. It creates possibilities that feel real. It starts to picture things that have not happened. It begins to form conclusions without evidence. And these conclusions carry emotional weight. The mind may create the idea that there is someone else, that you have been replaced, that something hidden is happening behind the silence, that the connection has already ended, even if no clear ending has been given. These thoughts feel convincing, not because they are true, but because they are detailed. The more the mind builds them, the more real they seem, and the more real they seem, the stronger the emotional response becomes. This is how mental fiction turns into emotional reality. You begin to feel hurt, not because something has happened, but because something has been imagined. You begin to feel anxious, not because there is danger, but because the mind has created a future that feels threatening. You begin to feel rejected, not because it has been confirmed, but because the story suggests it. And this is where suffering deepens. Because now you are not just dealing with what is happening, you are dealing with what the mind has created. And these creations are often more intense than reality itself. They are filled with worst-case scenarios, with hidden meanings, with imagined outcomes. And because they are not grounded in what is actually happening, they do not resolve. They continue to evolve. Each time you think about the situation, the story grows. It becomes more detailed, more convincing, more emotionally charged, and this creates a loop where the mind feeds itself, where each thought leads to another, where each assumption creates more assumptions, and in this loop it becomes difficult to see clearly, because the line between reality and imagination begins to blur. This is where awareness becomes essential in a deeper way, not just awareness of thoughts, but awareness of the nature of thoughts. Seeing that not everything the mind presents is real. Seeing that thoughts are not facts. Seeing that the mind can create entire experiences without external input. This recognition is powerful because it breaks the illusion. Not immediately, but gradually. When a thought arises, instead of immediately believing it, there is a pause. A moment of questioning. Is this something I know or something I'm imagining? This question creates space. It separates observation from interpretation. What is known becomes clear. There is distance, there is silence, there is a change, but beyond that, everything else is added. And once this is seen, the added layer begins to lose its strength. The stories do not disappear instantly, but they become lighter. They are no longer taken as truth. They are seen as possibilities, as mental activity, as something that can arise without needing to be followed. This changes the experience, because now, when the mind begins to build a story, there is awareness. There is recognition that this is happening. And in that recognition, there is a choice, not to suppress the thought, but not to engage with it, to let it appear without feeding it, to let it pass without expanding it. This is not easy at first, because the mind is used to involvement, used to following thoughts wherever they lead. But with practice, something begins to shift. The need to complete the story reduces. The urge to analyze every detail softens. The intensity of the imagined scenarios decreases, and slowly the mind begins to settle. Not because it has found answers, but because it is no longer creating unnecessary questions. This creates clarity, a clarity that is not based on knowing everything, but on not adding what is not known. And in this clarity, there is relief. Relief from the constant movement, relief from the emotional swings, relief from the feeling of being trapped in your own thinking. This is where freedom begins, not freedom from thoughts, but freedom from being controlled by them. The thoughts may still arise, the mind may still create stories, but they no longer define your experience. They no longer determine your emotional state. They become something that can be observed without being believed. And this observation creates distance, a healthy distance, a space between you and the thought, a space where you can remain present even when the mind is active. And in that space, there is peace, a peace that is not dependent on what the mind is doing, a peace that exists beneath the movement, a peace that remains even when thoughts arise. This peace is quiet. It does not need to be created. It is revealed when the noise settles, and as this continues, something becomes clear. Silence does not need to be filled. It can be experienced as it is, without interpretation, without story, without added meaning. And in that simplicity, there is stability. A stability that does not fluctuate with imagined scenarios. A stability that remains steady, even when the situation is unclear. This stability changes how you move through the experience. You are no longer reacting to every thought. You are no longer carried away by every possibility. You are grounded, present, aware. And from this place, the situation feels different, not necessarily resolved, but less overwhelming, less intense, less consuming, because you are no longer trapped in mental fiction. You are here with what is actually happening. And that is enough. Enough to breathe, enough to feel steady, enough to move forward without being pulled back into imagined realities. This is the deeper lesson, that the mind can create endless stories, but you do not have to live inside them. You can observe them, you can allow them, you can let them pass, and in doing so, you reclaim your space, your attention, your peace. And as this becomes more natural, something settles. The need to fill silence fades. The need to explain everything softens. The need to create meaning where there is none disappears. What remains is something much simpler, a direct experience of life as it is, without added layers, without unnecessary complexity, without the weight of imagined outcomes. And in that simplicity, there is freedom. A freedom that is not dependent on certainty, a freedom that is not limited by thought, a freedom that exists in the quiet space between what is real and what is imagined. And in that space, peace becomes steady. Not because everything is known, but because nothing extra is being created. And that is enough. And as that grip of mental stories begins to loosen, something else quietly becomes visible. Even when you stop believing every thought, even when silence is no longer filled with imagined endings, there is still a subtle habit that continues to drain your energy. It is not about thinking this time, it is about watching. A quiet tension begins to surface when attention stays fixed on another person's energy. Not in obvious ways, but in small, almost automatic checks. A glance at their response time, a feeling about their tone, a quick internal scan asking, do they feel the same? And without realizing it, the mind becomes occupied, constantly tracking, constantly interpreting, constantly adjusting. Something inside starts to stay on alert, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a steady, quiet way that never fully rests. It is always looking for signs, signs of warmth, signs of distance, signs of change. A message comes in, and instead of simply reading it, the mind reads into it. It looks for what is beneath the words. It listens for what is not being said. It measures the space between sentences. And even when there is no message, the monitoring continues. The absence itself becomes something to observe. How long has it been? Did they see it? Are they ignoring me? The mind begins to build a rhythm around this, a rhythm that is not based on presence, but on checking their mood, checking their behavior, checking their level of interest. And over time, this checking becomes exhausting. Not because it is intense, but because it is constant. It runs quietly in the background. It follows you into your day. It appears in moments that should feel simple. And it slowly drains your attention. Because instead of being here, your awareness is somewhere else. It is focused outward. Focused on something that is not within your control. This is where the deeper exhaustion begins. Not from what they are doing, but from what you are doing in response. From the habit of monitoring. From the need to stay aware of every shift. From the belief that if you watch closely enough, you will understand what is happening. But this belief creates pressure, because it turns another person's emotional state into your responsibility. It makes you feel like you need to keep track, like you need to stay updated, like you need to respond to every subtle change. And this creates a sense of work, a kind of emotional labor that never fully stops. You are not just experiencing the connection. You are managing it, observing it, trying to maintain balance within it. And this takes energy, a lot of it, because the mind is not designed to sustain constant monitoring. It needs rest. It needs space. It needs moments where it is not engaged in tracking or interpreting, but when attention is fixed on someone else's energy, that rest disappears. Even when nothing is happening, the mind is still active, still checking, still waiting, still trying to read between the lines. And this creates tension, a tension that sits quietly in the body. A tension that does not always feel sharp, but is always present. This is where awareness begins to shift again. Not toward the other person, but toward your own experience. noticing the act of monitoring itself, noticing how often the mind returns to them, noticing how quickly attention moves outward. This noticing is important because it reveals something that was previously automatic. It shows that the exhaustion is not just coming from the situation, it is coming from the way attention is being used. And once this is seen, something begins to change. There is an opportunity to pause, to interrupt the pattern, not by forcing yourself to stop caring, but by gently bringing attention back to what is here, back to your own experience, your breath, your body, the environment around you. This return is simple, but it is powerful, because it shifts the center of your awareness, from them to you, from monitoring to presence. And in this shift, something softens. The need to check reduces. The urge to analyze weakens. The constant scanning begins to slow down. This does not happen instantly. There may still be moments where the mind reaches outward, moments where it wants to check again. But each time you notice this, there is a choice to follow the habit or to return. And each return creates a little more space, a little more ease, a little more rest. This rest is important because it allows the mind to recover, to step out of the constant activity, to experience stillness again. And in that stillness, something becomes clear. You do not need to monitor someone else's energy to feel safe. You do not need to track their behavior to feel grounded. You do not need to stay alert to every change to maintain peace. Peace does not come from knowing what they are doing. It comes from being present with what you are experiencing. And when this is understood, something relaxes. The pressure to stay aware of everything disappears. The need to manage the connection fades. The sense of responsibility for their emotional state dissolves. And what remains is something much lighter, a natural way of being, where you can engage without overanalyzing, where you can connect without monitoring, where you can exist without constantly checking. This lightness creates freedom. The freedom to focus on your own life, your own thoughts, your own experiences, without being pulled back into someone else's behavior. And this freedom changes how you feel. The tension in your body begins to release. The mental noise reduces. The constant background activity fades. And in its place, there is calm. A calm that is not forced. A calm that arises naturally when the mind is no longer occupied. This calm is steady. It does not depend on what they are doing. It does not fluctuate with their responses. It remains quietly within you. And as this calm deepens, something else becomes possible. A different kind of connection. Not one based on monitoring, but one based on presence, where you can interact without overthinking, where you can communicate without analyzing every detail, where you can experience the moment as it is, without adding layers. This kind of connection is more natural, more relaxed, more real, because it is not controlled, it is allowed. And in this allowance, there is ease, an ease that was not possible before, when the mind was busy tracking and interpreting. This is the deeper lesson, that constantly monitoring another person's energy does not bring clarity. It brings exhaustion. And when that monitoring stops, even slightly, something begins to heal. The mind recovers, the body relaxes, the heart settles, and life becomes simpler. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer carrying the extra weight, the weight of constant observation, the weight of trying to understand everything, the weight of staying alert to every shift. Without that weight, you begin to move differently, more freely, more lightly, more calmly, and in that movement there is peace. A peace that is not dependent on what they feel, a peace that does not require constant checking, a peace that remains even when things are uncertain. And as this peace becomes more familiar, something becomes clear. You were never meant to carry someone else's emotional state. You were never meant to monitor their every shift. You were never meant to treat their behavior as your responsibility. You are here to experience your own life, to be present with your own awareness, to move through your own moments with clarity and ease. And when attention returns to that, everything changes. The mind rests, the body softens, the heart opens, not outward in effort, but inward in peace. And in that peace, something beautiful happens. You are no longer chasing, you are no longer watching, you are simply here, and that is enough. And as that quiet rest begins to settle more deeply, something even more subtle begins to appear. When the mind is no longer chasing, no longer monitoring, no longer creating endless stories, there is still one place it quietly returns to, not the past, not the present, but the future that never happened. There is a kind of pain that does not come from what was shared, but from what was imagined. It is not always obvious at first, but it carries a deeper weight. A feeling that something meaningful was lost, even if it never fully existed. The mind begins to revisit not just memories, but possibilities. It recalls how things felt, but more importantly, how they could have unfolded. It holds onto small moments and stretches them forward into imagined outcomes. A simple connection becomes a future relationship. A few meaningful conversations become a life that never had the chance to form. A feeling becomes a story. And this story becomes something the heart holds on to. This is where clinging to potential begins. It is not attachment to what was clearly real. It is attachment to what felt possible. And this attachment is powerful because potential feels open. It feels hopeful. It feels alive. But when it is interrupted, when the connection changes, when the other person steps away, that potential does not disappear easily. It lingers, and the mind continues to hold on to it. You may notice how often the thought arises, it could have been something. Not as a clear statement, but as a quiet feeling, a sense that something meaningful was just beginning, a sense that if things had continued, it would have grown into something deeper. And this sense becomes something the heart resists letting go of. Because letting go of potential feels like letting go of something unfinished, something that did not get the chance to become real. And this creates a unique kind of suffering, because it is not tied to what actually happened, it is tied to what never happened. And what never happened has no clear shape. It has no boundaries. It has no ending, which makes it harder to release. The mind fills in the details. It imagines how things would have progressed, how the connection would have deepened, how the future would have looked. And each of these imagined outcomes feels real, not because they occurred, but because they are felt. And this feeling creates attachment, an attachment to something that only exists in the mind. This is where confusion begins, because the heart responds to these imagined futures as if they were real experiences. It feels loss, it feels disappointment, it feels like something valuable has been taken away. But what has been taken away is not something that was fully formed, it is something that was being projected forward. And this projection creates pain because the mind compares reality to imagination. It looks at what is and it measures it against what could have been. And in that comparison, reality always feels lacking because imagination is not limited. It can create perfect scenarios, ideal outcomes, smooth progressions. It removes uncertainty. It removes difficulty. It creates a version of events that feels complete. And when reality does not match that version, it feels like something is missing. But nothing real has been taken away. Only the imagined path has been interrupted. This is where Buddhist understanding offers a deeper perspective. It invites you to see that clinging to potential is still a form of attachment. Not to the past, not to the present, but to an imagined future. And like all forms of attachment, it creates suffering, because it resists what is. It tries to hold onto something that is not here. It tries to keep alive a version of reality that never fully existed, and in doing so, it prevents the mind from resting, because there is always something unfinished. always something that feels incomplete, always something that could have been different. This is where letting go becomes necessary again. Not letting go of the person, not letting go of the experience, but letting go of the imagined continuation, letting go of the idea that it had to become something more, letting go of the belief that potential must be fulfilled. This does not mean dismissing what was felt. The connection may have been real, the moments may have been meaningful, but the future that was built around those moments is not something that needs to be held on to. It is something that can be released. And this release creates space, a space where the mind is no longer projecting forward, a space where the heart is no longer holding on to what never came, a space where reality can be experienced without comparison. This space brings relief because the tension between what is and what could have been begins to dissolve. The mind no longer tries to reconcile the two. It no longer tries to bring imagination into reality. It simply rests in what is here. And in that resting, something shifts. The pain reduces. Not because the situation has changed, but because the added layer of expectation has been removed. What remains is simpler. There was a connection. It changed. That is all. No additional narrative, no extended storyline, no imagined future that needs to be grieved. And in this simplicity, there is clarity. A clarity that allows you to see things as they are, without distortion, without projection, without attachment to something that was never fully real. This clarity creates peace, a peace that does not depend on how things could have been, a peace that is grounded in how things are. And as this peace deepens, something else becomes possible, a different relationship with possibility itself. Instead of holding on to specific imagined outcomes, there is an openness to what may come, not tied to a particular person, not tied to a specific path, but open, flexible, free from expectation. This openness is lighter. It does not carry the weight of needing something to happen. It allows life to unfold without being shaped by rigid ideas. And in this openness, there is freedom. The freedom to move forward without looking back at what never became real. The freedom to experience new connections without comparing them to imagined ones. The freedom to exist without carrying the weight of unfinished futures. And as this freedom becomes more familiar, something becomes clear. The pain was not coming from what was lost. It was coming from what was being held onto. An imagined version of what could have been. And once that is released, the experience changes. Not dramatically, but quietly. The mind becomes less heavy. The heart becomes less burdened. The overall experience becomes more grounded, more real, more present. This is the deeper lesson. That potential is not something that needs to be preserved. It is something that naturally changes. And when it is no longer held onto, something else emerges. A sense of completion, not because everything reached its full form, but because nothing is being forced to continue. This completion is not about closure. It is about acceptance. Acceptance that not every possibility becomes reality. Acceptance that not every connection continues. Acceptance that some things exist only for a moment. And that is enough. Enough to be felt. Enough to be experienced. Enough to be released. And in that release, peace becomes steady. Not dependent on what could have been, but rooted in what is. And that is where the heart finally rests. And as that grip on imagined futures begins to loosen, something even more revealing starts to come into focus. When you stop holding on to what could have been, when the mind no longer builds stories about a future that never arrived, there is still one question that quietly remains beneath everything. What was this feeling, really? Because when someone pulls away, the pain can feel like love. It can feel deep, intense, and meaningful. It can feel like something sacred has been disturbed. But when the noise settles, when the stories fade, and when the imagined future dissolves, something more subtle begins to appear. Not everything that feels like love is actually love. Something feels strong, almost overwhelming, But at the same time, something about it feels unstable. It feels like your emotional state depends on their presence. When they are there, everything feels calm. When they are distant, everything feels uncertain. This is where the distinction begins to reveal itself. There is a quiet difference between loving someone and depending on them. At first, this difference is not easy to see, because both can feel intense. Both can feel important. Both can create strong emotional experiences, but one brings peace, while the other creates instability. When love is present, there is space. You can care deeply, but still feel grounded within yourself. You can appreciate the connection, but still feel whole on your own. You can enjoy their presence, but not collapse in their absence. But when psychological dependence is present, the experience changes. Your emotional state becomes tied to their behavior. If they respond warmly, you feel secure. If they become distant, you feel anxious. If they show interest, you feel valued. If they withdraw, you feel uncertain. And without realizing it, your inner stability begins to depend on something outside of you. This is where suffering quietly grows, because now your sense of calm is no longer coming from within. It is being borrowed from their attention, borrowed from their presence, borrowed from their consistency, and anything that is borrowed can be taken away. This is why the experience feels unstable, because it is. It is not rooted in something steady. It is rooted in something that changes, and when it changes, the impact is felt deeply. You may notice how quickly your mood shifts based on their behavior. A simple message can lift your energy. A delay can lower it. A small change in tone can create doubt. And this constant movement creates exhaustion. Not because you care, but because your emotional balance is being influenced externally. This is where attachment disguises itself as devotion. It feels like you are deeply invested, like you are committed, like you are giving your full attention to the connection. But beneath that, there is a subtle dependency, a need for their presence to feel okay, a need for their response to feel stable, a need for their attention to feel valued. And this need creates pressure. Pressure on the connection, pressure on yourself. Because now you are not just relating to them, you are relying on them. And this reliance changes the experience. It turns connection into necessity. It turns care into need. It turns love into something that feels like survival. This is where Buddhist understanding offers a clear and gentle insight. It shows that true love is not something that binds your sense of self to another person. It is something that allows both people to exist freely, without control, without dependency, without the need to complete each other. Love does not take away your center. It does not replace your inner stability. It does not become the source of your emotional balance. It coexists with it. It adds to your experience, but it does not define it. And when this is understood, something begins to shift. The way you relate to the connection changes. Instead of looking outward for stability, you begin to return inward. You begin to notice your own breath, your own presence, your own sense of being. And in that noticing, something begins to rebuild. A sense of inner grounding, a feeling of being steady within yourself. This grounding is important because it creates independence, not emotional detachment, but emotional stability. A stability that does not fluctuate with someone else's actions. A stability that remains even when things change. And as this stability grows, the nature of the connection changes as well. You no longer feel the same urgency, the same need, the same dependency. You can still care, you can still feel. But you are no longer relying on them to regulate your emotional state. This creates space. A space where you can observe your feelings without being overwhelmed by them. A space where you can experience connection without losing yourself in it. A space where you can remain present even when things are uncertain. This space is where peace begins, not because the connection becomes perfect, but because your relationship to it becomes balanced. You are no longer trying to hold on to it for stability. You are allowing it to exist without needing it to define your inner state. And in that allowance, something softens. The tension reduces. The emotional swings become less intense. The constant need for reassurance fades, because you are no longer looking outward for something that can only be found inward. This inward return is quiet. It does not happen suddenly. It develops through awareness, through noticing when your mood shifts based on their behavior, through recognizing when your thoughts revolve around their actions, through seeing when your sense of self begins to depend on their response. Each time this is noticed, there is an opportunity to pause, to return, to reconnect with yourself. This return may feel unfamiliar at first, because the habit of looking outward has been strong, but with time it becomes more natural, more steady, more available. And as this continues, something becomes clear. You do not need another person to feel complete. You do not need their attention to feel grounded. You do not need their presence to feel okay. These things can enhance your experience, but they are not the foundation of it. The foundation is within you, your awareness, your presence, your ability to remain steady, regardless of external changes. And when this foundation is strong, the connection becomes different. It becomes something that can be enjoyed, rather than something that must be maintained at all costs. It becomes something that can exist freely, rather than something that must be controlled. It becomes something that adds to your life, rather than something that defines it. This is the difference between love and psychological dependence. One is open, the other is tight. One allows, the other clings. One is steady, the other fluctuates. And when this difference is clearly seen, the path becomes clear as well. Not a path of detachment, but a path of balance, where you can care without losing yourself, where you can connect without depending, where you can feel deeply without becoming unstable. And in that balance, there is peace, a peace that does not disappear when someone pulls away, a peace that remains quietly within you. And as this peace deepens, something beautiful happens. You begin to experience connection in a new way, not as something you need to survive, but as something you can share, not as something you must hold on to, but as something you can allow. And in that allowing, love becomes lighter, freer, more real, and most importantly, it no longer takes away your peace. It exists alongside it. And that is where true inner stability begins. And as that inner stability begins to grow, another quiet fear begins to reveal itself. Even when dependence softens, even when the need for their attention is no longer controlling your emotions, there can still be something deeper that lingers beneath the surface. It is not about needing them. It is about being remembered by them. A quiet discomfort appears, not always loud, but deeply felt. A sense that as they move on, you might slowly disappear from their world. That the moments you shared, the connection you felt, may fade in their memory as if it never held the same weight. And this thought carries a unique kind of pain. There is a subtle ache that arises when the mind considers the possibility of being forgotten, not just physically, but emotionally. The idea that you may no longer occupy a meaningful space in their thoughts, that what mattered to you may no longer matter to them. And this feeling is not always easy to face, because it touches something very sensitive, the desire to be significant, the desire to have left an impression, the desire to be someone who is not easily replaced or erased. When someone pulls away, the mind does not only deal with their absence. It begins to imagine what happens after. It pictures their life continuing, their attention shifting, their energy being directed elsewhere. And within that image, there is a question: will they still think of me? This question may not always be spoken, but it is felt. It carries a quiet vulnerability. Because it is not just about memory, it is about meaning, about whether the connection had lasting value in their experience. And when the mind does not have an answer, it often assumes the worst. It imagines that you are no longer important, that you have been replaced, that your presence is fading, and this imagination creates pain, because it feels like something about you is being diminished, not in your own eyes, but in theirs. This is where the fear of being forgotten becomes powerful. It is not just about losing connection, it is about losing significance. And this fear can quietly influence your thoughts and emotions. You may find yourself wanting to reach out, not because you need connection, but because you want to remain in their awareness. You may feel a subtle urge to remind them of your presence, to ensure that you are not completely erased. And this urge comes from a very human place, the desire to matter. But when this desire becomes tied to another person's memory, it creates instability, because memory is not something you can control. People remember in their own way. They move through their experiences differently. What stays with them and what fades is not something that can be influenced through effort. And when your sense of value becomes connected to how someone remembers you, it creates dependence. A dependence that is not visible on the surface, but deeply felt inside, because now your worth feels linked to something outside of you, something that can change without your involvement. And this creates insecurity, because there is no guarantee, no certainty, no way to ensure that you remain significant in their mind. This is where Buddhist wisdom offers a deeper understanding. It invites you to look at the nature of identity itself, to see that the idea of being remembered is not the same as being valuable, that your existence does not gain or lose meaning based on someone else's thoughts, that your worth is not something that needs to be preserved in another person's memory. Because memory is temporary, it shifts, it fades, it transforms over time, and if your value depends on something that is constantly changing, it will always feel unstable. But when your value is rooted within yourself, it becomes steady. It no longer depends on external recognition. It no longer needs to be confirmed through remembrance. It simply exists. And this understanding changes how you experience the situation. The fear begins to soften, not because the possibility disappears, but because it no longer carries the same weight. You begin to see that being forgotten does not erase what was real. It does not diminish the moments that were shared. It does not take away the experience you had. Those things remain part of your life, part of your understanding, part of your growth. They do not need to be remembered by someone else to have value. This shift is subtle but powerful because it removes the need to hold on to significance externally. It allows you to bring that significance inward, to recognize that your experience matters regardless of how it is held by another person. And in that recognition, something changes. The urgency to remain in their awareness fades. The need to be remembered becomes less important. The focus begins to return to your own presence, your own experience, your own life. This return creates space. A space where you are no longer concerned with how you exist in someone else's mind. A space where your attention is no longer divided. A space where you can simply be without needing validation through memory. And in that space, there is peace. A peace that is not dependent on being held in someone else's thoughts. A peace that is not affected by whether you are remembered or forgotten. A peace that remains steady because it is rooted within you. This peace changes how you see yourself. You no longer measure your worth based on external perception. You no longer seek confirmation through someone else's attention. You no longer feel diminished when someone moves on, because your sense of self is not tied to those movements. It is grounded, stable, independent. And from this place, something else becomes possible. A different relationship with memory itself. You can appreciate what was shared without needing it to continue. You can hold on to the meaning without needing it to be preserved by someone else. You can honor the experience without needing it to define your present. This creates freedom, the freedom to let others move forward without feeling left behind. The freedom to allow change without feeling erased. The freedom to exist without needing to be remembered. And in this freedom, there is lightness. A lightness that was not possible before. When the mind was concerned with significance, with presence, with being held in another person's awareness. Now that concern fades, and what remains is something much simpler, a quiet understanding. That your value is not something that can be lost. That your presence is not something that needs to be preserved externally. That your existence is meaningful, regardless of how it is remembered. And this understanding brings calm, a calm that does not fluctuate with thoughts, a calm that does not depend on external validation, a calm that remains steady, quietly within you. As this calm deepens, something becomes clear. Being forgotten is not the same as losing your worth. It is simply part of the natural movement of life. People come and go, memories form and fade, connections shift and change. But through all of this, your presence remains, your awareness remains, your ability to experience life remains. And that is where your true value lies, not in how you are remembered, but in how you exist. And when this is truly seen, the fear dissolves, not completely, not instantly, but gradually. It loses its intensity, it loses its grip, and what replaces it is something much more stable, a sense of self that does not depend on memory, a presence that does not need to be held by others, a quiet confidence that remains regardless of who stays or who moves on. And in that confidence, there is peace, a peace that does not seek recognition, a peace that does not fear being forgotten, a peace that simply is. And in that being, everything settles, not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has, and that is where true inner freedom begins. And as that quiet confidence begins to take root, another hidden pattern slowly comes into view. Even when the fear of being forgotten softens, even when your sense of value is no longer tied to someone else's memory, there is still something the mind continues to hold on to very tightly. The need to be certain, not just about what happened, but about everything. About why it changed, what it meant, what it says about the connection, and what it means for the future. The mind does not like loose ends. It does not like unanswered questions. It wants clarity, finality, and complete understanding. And when it does not get that, it keeps returning. There is a quiet restlessness that appears when things are unclear, a subtle discomfort that feels like something is unresolved. The situation may have already changed, the connection may already be distant, but the mind does not settle. It circles back. It reopens questions. It tries again to make sense of what happened. And beneath all of that movement, there is one belief driving it. That peace will only come once everything is fully understood. There is a certain kind of discomfort that feels unfinished, like a sentence that was never completed. Something inside keeps going back, not because the moment is still active, but because it feels unresolved. The mind holds on to the idea that if it can just understand the full picture, the confusion will end. That if it can just find the right explanation, everything will settle into place. But this belief creates a loop, because the explanation it is searching for is not always available. Not everything can be explained clearly. Not every situation has a clean answer. Not every change comes with a reason that feels satisfying. And when the mind cannot find what it is looking for, it does not stop. It tries harder. It thinks more. It revisits the same details again and again, hoping that something new will appear. But nothing new comes. Only the same thoughts, repeated in different ways. And this repetition keeps the wound open. Because each time the mind returns to the question, it reactivates the experience. It brings the uncertainty back into the present. It keeps the emotional response alive. And as long as the question remains active, the feeling does not fully settle. This is how craving certainty creates suffering. Not because wanting clarity is wrong, but because depending on it prevents the mind from resting. You may notice how difficult it feels to let go of something that is not fully understood. There is a sense that if you move on without clarity, you are leaving something unfinished. But this is an illusion, because the need for completeness is coming from the mind, not from reality. Reality does not require explanation to continue. It moves regardless of whether you understand it. But the mind resists this. It wants everything to make sense before it allows itself to relax. And this resistance creates tension, a tension that feels like something is still open, something that still needs to be resolved. But what if resolution does not come through understanding? What if peace does not depend on having all the answers? This is where a deeper shift begins. Not by forcing the mind to stop asking questions, but by changing how those questions are held. Instead of treating them as problems that must be solved, they are allowed to exist without immediate resolution. This changes the experience, because now the mind is not pressured to find an answer. It is allowed to not know. And this allowance creates space, a space where uncertainty is not treated as danger, a space where not having clarity is not seen as a problem, a space where the mind can rest, even without full understanding. This is not easy at first, because the mind is used to control, used to solving, used to closing every open loop. So when it is asked to remain in uncertainty, it reacts. It tries to return to the search. It tries to find something to hold on to. But if you stay with the uncertainty, something begins to change. The discomfort starts to soften, the urgency reduces, the need to resolve everything immediately fades, and in that fading, something new appears, a sense of acceptance, not forced, not intellectual, but felt. An acceptance that not everything will be explained, that not everything will make perfect sense, that some things will remain open, and that this is okay. This acceptance is not passive. It is not giving up. It is a form of inner freedom. Freedom from the need to control every outcome. Freedom from the need to understand everything before moving forward. Freedom from the belief that peace requires certainty. And when this freedom begins to take hold, something shifts. The mind becomes quieter, not because all questions have been answered, but because they are no longer being chased. The emotional intensity reduces, not because everything is resolved, but because the resistance has softened. And this creates a different experience, one where you can live with uncertainty without feeling overwhelmed, one where you can move forward without needing complete clarity, one where you can feel peace, even in the presence of unanswered questions. This is where true healing begins. Not when everything is understood, but when the need for understanding is no longer driving the experience. Because as long as the mind is searching, the wound remains active. But when the search softens, the wound begins to close, not because the situation has changed, but because your relationship to it has. This is the deeper lesson, that craving certainty is not what brings peace, it is what prevents it. And when that craving is released, even slightly, something opens, a sense of ease, a sense of lightness, a sense of being able to exist without needing to figure everything out. This ease is quiet. It does not come with a dramatic realization. It appears gradually, in moments where you would have searched before, but now you pause. In moments where you would have questioned, but now you allow. In moments where you would have needed answers, but now you rest. These moments are small, but they are powerful. They show that something is changing, that the mind is learning a new way of being. A way that is not driven by control, a way that is not dependent on certainty, a way that allows life to unfold without constant interference. And as this way becomes more natural, something becomes clear. You do not need to know everything to feel at peace. You do not need to solve every question to move forward. You do not need to close every loop to feel complete. Peace is not the result of perfect understanding. It is the result of allowing things to remain as they are, and when this is truly seen, something relaxes, the tension disappears, The need to search fades. The constant return to the same questions stops. What remains is something much simpler, a quiet presence, a steady awareness, a calm that does not depend on answers. And in that calm, the wound begins to close, not because it was solved, but because it was no longer being reopened. And that is where true freedom begins, not in certainty, but in the ability to remain at peace without it. And as that need for certainty begins to loosen, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself. When the mind is no longer chasing answers, when it is no longer trying to force clarity, there is still one place where attention quietly returns, not to questions this time, but to comparison. A quiet measuring begins to happen, not loudly, not consciously at first, but in small, repeated moments. You notice how often they reach out. You notice how quickly they respond. You notice how much effort seems to come from their side. And without realizing it, something inside begins to adjust, not based on who you are, but based on what they are doing. There is a silent moment where the heart begins to ask something it does not always say out loud. Am I still important to them? And from that question, a pattern begins to form. The way you feel about yourself starts to shift depending on their effort. If they message often, you feel valued. If they take longer, something feels off. If they seem engaged, you feel secure. If they become distant, something inside you drops. And slowly, almost invisibly, your sense of worth begins to move with their behavior. This is where the quiet damage begins, because your self-esteem is no longer stable. It is fluctuating. It is rising and falling based on something that is not under your control. And this creates instability, not in the connection alone, but within yourself. You may notice how quickly your mood changes after a single interaction. A short reply can make you question everything. A warm message can bring temporary relief, but that relief does not last, because it depends on the next interaction, and the next, and the next. This creates a cycle where your inner state is constantly adjusting to external signals. And this cycle is exhausting because it never settles. There is always something to check, something to interpret, something to measure. And beneath all of this, there is a deeper issue. Your worth has become negotiable, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle one. It is being shaped by how much someone else gives, by how much they show, by how much they invest. And when that investment changes, your sense of value changes with it. This is where suffering deepens, because now you are not just experiencing the connection, you are evaluating yourself through it. You are using their effort as a reflection of your importance, and this reflection is unstable, because it is based on something that is always changing. People's behavior is influenced by many things: their mood, their circumstances, their priorities, their own internal state, and none of these are fixed. But when your worth depends on these changing factors, it creates constant fluctuation. You begin to feel unsure of yourself, not because something about you has changed, but because the external signal has. And this creates confusion, because you start to believe that your value is something that needs to be confirmed repeatedly, that it needs to be shown through action, that it needs to be proven through consistency. But this belief creates dependency, a dependency on reassurance, a dependency on attention, a dependency on effort. And when that reassurance is not present, the mind begins to react. It starts questioning, it starts comparing, it starts looking for evidence, and this brings back the same patterns. Overthinking, doubt, emotional instability, all of this begins to build again, not because of what is happening externally, but because of how it is being interpreted internally. This is where a deeper understanding begins to emerge. That your worth is not something that can be measured through someone else's behavior. It is not something that increases when they give more. It is not something that decreases when they give less. It is not something that needs to be confirmed through their actions. It exists independently, But this understanding needs to be felt, not just thought, because the habit of measuring is strong. It has been reinforced over time, through past experiences, through patterns of validation, through the belief that being valued externally equals being valuable internally. And breaking this pattern requires awareness, noticing when the mind begins to measure, noticing when your mood shifts based on their effort, noticing when your thoughts start to revolve around their behavior. Each time this is noticed, there is an opportunity to pause, to step back, to question the assumption, to ask quietly, is my worth really changing, or is my perception shifting? This question creates space, a space where you can separate yourself from the pattern, a space where you can see that the fluctuation is not coming from your value, but from your interpretation. And in that space, something begins to stabilize. Your sense of self starts to return, not as something that needs to be built, but as something that was always there. Unchanging, unaffected by external movement. This return is quiet. It does not happen all at once. It develops gradually, through repeated moments of awareness, through choosing not to engage with the measuring, through allowing your worth to remain steady, regardless of what is happening externally. And as this stability grows, something changes. The need for constant reassurance reduces. The urge to check for effort weakens. The emotional swings become less intense, because your inner state is no longer tied to external signals. This creates peace. A peace that is not dependent on how often someone texts. A peace that does not fluctuate with their level of engagement. A peace that remains steady, because it is rooted within you. And from this place, something else becomes possible. A different kind of connection. One that is not based on measurement. One that is not driven by comparison. One that does not require constant validation. It becomes simpler, more natural, more relaxed. Because it is no longer carrying the weight of defining your worth. You can engage without overanalyzing. You can respond without overthinking. You can exist within the connection without losing yourself in it. This is the deeper healing, not in changing the other person's behavior, but in changing your relationship to it. In no longer using it as a mirror for your value, in no longer allowing it to determine how you feel about yourself. And as this healing continues, something becomes clear. Your worth was never dependent on their effort. It was only being interpreted that way, and once that interpretation is released, everything changes. The connection becomes lighter. Your experience becomes calmer. Your sense of self becomes stable. And in that stability, there is freedom. The freedom to exist without constant evaluation. The freedom to feel without needing confirmation. The freedom to be without needing to be measured. And in that freedom, peace becomes steady. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is being used to define you. And that is where true inner balance begins. A balance that does not rise and fall, a balance that remains quietly within you. And from that place, everything feels different. Not because the world has changed, but because you have stopped measuring yourself against it. And in that shift, everything settles, gently, naturally, completely. And as that inner balance begins to steady itself, something deeper starts to surface. Even when you stop measuring your worth by their effort, even when your sense of value is no longer rising and falling with their attention, there can still be moments where the reaction feels stronger than expected, stronger than the situation seems to deserve. A simple shift, a small distance, a subtle change, and suddenly something inside feels heavy. Not just uncomfortable, but almost overwhelming, as if the feeling is coming from somewhere deeper than the present moment. And this is where something important begins to reveal itself. Sometimes, what you are feeling is not only about now. There are moments when someone pulls away, and the reaction feels immediate and intense. Not just sadness, not just confusion, but something that feels familiar in a deeper way. A kind of ache that feels older than the situation itself. It shows up as a tightening in the chest, a sense of being left behind, a quiet fear that something important is slipping away again. And even when you try to calm yourself, the feeling does not respond easily. It lingers, it expands, it takes up space, and you may wonder why something that seems small is creating such a strong reaction. This is where emotional memory begins to play a role, because the mind does not only respond to what is happening now, it connects it to what has happened before. Not always consciously, not always clearly, but in subtle ways that shape your experience. When someone withdraws, it can touch something deeper, something that has been felt before. A memory of disconnection, a memory of absence, a memory of not being held in the way you needed. These memories do not always appear as clear images or events. They appear as feelings, as sensations, as emotional patterns. And when something in the present resembles those patterns, the response becomes amplified. This is how old wounds become activated, not because the present situation is the same, but because it feels similar. The body recognizes the feeling, the mind reacts to the pattern, and suddenly the experience becomes larger than the moment. You may notice how quickly the fear appears, not just the fear of losing this connection, but a deeper fear, a fear of being left, of being alone, of not being chosen. And this fear does not come from the current situation alone. It comes from a place that has felt this before, a place that has not fully healed. This is what makes the experience feel so intense. Because it is not just one moment, it is many moments layered together, past and present blending into one emotional response. And when this happens, it becomes difficult to separate what is happening now from what is being remembered. This is where awareness becomes essential in a more compassionate way. Not to analyze, not to fix, but to gently notice. To notice that the intensity may not be coming only from the present. To notice that something deeper is being touched, and to allow that recognition without judgment. This is important because when you understand that the reaction is connected to older patterns, something begins to soften. Not the feeling itself, but your relationship to it. Instead of being overwhelmed, you begin to observe. Instead of reacting immediately, you begin to pause. And in that pause, there is space. A space where you can see more clearly. That this moment is not the same as the past. That this person is not the same as those who came before. That what is happening now does not need to be experienced through the same lens. This does not mean dismissing the feeling. The feeling is real. The emotion is present. But the interpretation can change. You begin to see that the intensity is not just about the current situation. It is about what the situation reminds you of. And this understanding creates compassion. Compassion for yourself, for the part of you that has felt this before, for the part of you that is reacting not out of weakness, but out of memory. And this compassion changes the experience, because instead of pushing the feeling away, you allow it. You sit with it, you acknowledge it, without trying to solve it immediately. This sitting is quiet. It does not require words. It does not require action. It simply requires presence. And in that presence, something begins to settle. The emotional wave does not disappear instantly, but it becomes less overwhelming, because it is no longer being resisted. It is being held gently, without pressure, without urgency. And as this continues, something important begins to happen. The connection between past and present starts to loosen. You begin to feel the current situation more clearly, without the added weight of previous experiences, without the amplification of old patterns. You begin to respond to what is actually happening rather than what it reminds you of. This is where healing begins, not by changing the external situation, but by changing how it is experienced internally, by recognizing that not every feeling needs to be followed, that not every reaction is a reflection of the present, that some responses are echoes. And when those echoes are seen clearly, they begin to lose their power. They are no longer confusing. They are no longer overwhelming. They are understood. And in that understanding, there is relief. A quiet relief that comes from clarity, from seeing that the feeling is not something to fear, but something to understand. And as this understanding deepens, something else changes. The fear of abandonment begins to soften. Not because the possibility disappears, but because it is no longer tied to the same intensity. It is no longer carrying the weight of past experiences. It is seen as part of the present moment, not as a repetition of the past. This creates stability, a stability that allows you to remain grounded even when things feel uncertain, a stability that does not collapse under emotional waves, a stability that remains even when the situation shifts. And from this stability, a different kind of strength emerges, not the strength of control, not the strength of avoidance, but the strength of awareness. The ability to feel without being overwhelmed, the ability to observe without reacting, the ability to remain present even when old patterns are activated. This strength is quiet. It does not force, it does not resist, it allows, and in that allowing, something transforms. The past begins to lose its hold, the present becomes clearer, the emotional experience becomes lighter, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer carrying extra weight. And as this continues, something becomes clear. You are not defined by your past experiences. You are not controlled by old patterns. You are capable of seeing, understanding, and moving beyond them. And in that realization, there is freedom. A freedom that does not come from changing others, but from understanding yourself. A freedom that allows you to experience connection without being bound by previous pain. A freedom that creates space for something new. Something not shaped by old wounds. Something not driven by past fear. Something that can exist in the present as it is. And in that space, peace begins to deepen. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything is seen clearly. And when things are seen clearly, they lose their ability to overwhelm. They become manageable, understandable, allowable, and from that place the heart begins to relax, gently, naturally, without force, without resistance. And in that relaxation, healing continues, quietly, steadily, from within. And as that deeper layer of understanding begins to settle, something else quietly comes into view. Even when you recognize old wounds, even when you respond with awareness instead of reaction, there can still be a subtle habit that continues to pull your energy outward. It is not about the past this time, it is about what you keep doing in the present. A quiet movement begins to show itself, not loud, not dramatic, but constant. A reaching, a checking, a subtle effort to keep the connection alive. And without noticing it, your peace begins to depend on how much you are doing to hold something together. There is a quiet urge that often hides beneath care. It does not announce itself clearly, but it moves your actions in a very specific way. It shows up as the need to reach out first, to check in again, to explain more, to fix what feels uncertain. It feels like effort, but more than that, it feels necessary. Something inside begins to believe that if you do not act, something will be lost. That if you do not reach, the connection will fade. That if you do not try harder, things will fall apart. And from this belief, a role begins to form. The role of the pursuer. Not always obvious, not always intentional, but present in small ways that slowly shape your experience. You begin to notice how often your energy moves outward, how often your attention is directed toward maintaining something, how often your actions are guided by the need to keep the connection alive. This role feels active, it feels responsible, it feels like you are doing what is needed. But beneath that, there is tension. Because the more you take on the role of pursuer, the more your peace begins to depend on response, on acknowledgement, on reciprocation. And when that does not come in the way you expect, something shifts inside. You begin to feel imbalance, not because the connection is gone, but because the effort is not equal. You notice the gap between what you give and what you receive, between how much you try and how much they respond. And this gap creates discomfort, because now your sense of stability is tied to something outside your control. You may notice how your thoughts begin to revolve around what you should do next. Whether you should message again, whether you should wait, whether you should adjust your approach. The mind becomes strategic, not in a calm way, but in a restless one. It tries to find the right move, the right timing, the right tone, all in the hope of bringing things back into balance. But this creates exhaustion, because it turns connection into effort. It turns presence into performance. It turns something that should feel natural into something that feels like work. And this work never truly ends, because the outcome is not guaranteed. You can reach and not receive. You can give and not feel it returned. You can try and still feel the distance. And this is where the role of pursuer begins to drain you. Not because effort is wrong, but because it becomes constant. Because it replaces rest. Because it removes the space where you can simply be. This is where a deeper realization begins to form. That constantly reaching does not create connection. It creates dependency, a dependency on action, a dependency on response, a dependency on maintaining something that may not be naturally flowing. And when this is seen clearly, something begins to shift. Not in your feelings, but in your behavior. You begin to notice the moments where you feel the urge to act, the impulse to send another message, the need to clarify something, the desire to bring things back to how they were. And instead of immediately following that impulse, there is a pause, a quiet moment where you ask yourself, is this coming from peace or from fear? This question changes everything, because it brings awareness to the movement. It reveals whether the action is coming from a grounded place or from a need to control the outcome. And in that awareness, there is choice, a choice to not act immediately, a choice to sit with the feeling instead, a choice to allow the moment to exist without trying to fix it. This is where something powerful begins, not doing, not reaching, not pursuing, just being. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. Because the habit of action is strong, the mind may say, if you do nothing, you will lose everything. But this is the same voice that has been driving the exhaustion. The same voice that has been keeping you in constant movement. And when you begin to not follow it, something changes. The urgency begins to fade. The pressure reduces. The constant need to act softens. And in that softening, something returns. Your energy. Energy that was being spent on reaching. Energy that was being used to maintain. Energy that was being directed outward. Now begins to come back inward. And this inward return creates strength. Not the kind of strength that forces or controls, but the kind that remains steady. A strength that does not depend on action. A strength that is comfortable with stillness. A strength that does not need to chase. This strength is quiet. It does not need to prove anything. It does not need to hold anything together. It simply remains. And from this place, something shifts in how you experience the connection. You are no longer trying to sustain it. You are allowing it. You are no longer trying to manage it. You are observing it. You are no longer trying to fix it. You are experiencing it as it is. This changes the dynamic completely. Because the pressure is gone, the constant effort is gone, the need to maintain is gone, and what remains is something much more natural, a space where things can either flow or not, without force, without manipulation, without constant involvement. And in this space, clarity begins to appear. You begin to see the connection more clearly, not through the lens of effort, but through the reality of how it exists. Whether it is mutual, whether it is balanced, whether it is naturally sustained. And this clarity is important, because it allows you to respond from truth, not from effort, from awareness, not from fear, from stability, not from need. And as this continues, something becomes clear. You do not need to chase what is meant to stay. You do not need to hold together what is naturally stable. You do not need to pursue what is already present. And when something requires constant pursuit, it is no longer connection, it is maintenance. And maintenance creates exhaustion. But when you step out of that role, something changes. You begin to feel lighter, less pressured, less involved in constant action, more present, more aware, more grounded. And in that groundedness, there is peace. A peace that does not depend on what you are doing. A peace that does not require constant effort. A peace that remains, even in stillness. This is the deeper freedom. Not the freedom of controlling the situation, but the freedom of not needing to. The freedom to stop reaching, to stop checking, to stop proving, to stop fixing. And in that stopping, something returns. Your sense of self, your sense of presence, your sense of peace. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. Not because the situation has changed, but because you have. You are no longer in pursuit. You are in presence. And in that presence, there is strength. A quiet, steady strength that does not move unless it needs to. A strength that does not chase. A strength that does not depend on response. A strength that simply remains. And in that remaining, peace becomes natural again, not forced, not maintained, but present, always, within you. And as that quiet strength begins to settle, something even more delicate starts to reveal itself. When you stop pursuing, when you stop reaching, when your energy is no longer constantly moving outward, there is still a moment that can feel deeply uncomfortable. A moment where nothing comes back. No response, no reflection, no return. And in that space, something inside feels exposed. There is a kind of pain that feels heavier than distance itself. Not because something ended, but because something you gave did not return in the same way. The care you offered, the attention you shared, the presence you held, it now feels like it is standing alone, unanswered, unmatched. And this is where the heart feels most vulnerable, because giving is natural, caring is natural. But when that care is not mirrored, something inside begins to question itself, not loudly, but quietly. Was it too much? Was it misplaced? Did it mean less to them? And even when the mind understands what is happening, the feeling remains, a sense of imbalance, a sense that something is incomplete, a sense that what was offered is now hanging in space without support. This is where many people begin to collapse inward, not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. The energy that was once flowing outward begins to turn back on itself. And this turning can create discomfort, because the heart is not used to holding what was meant to be shared. It is used to exchange, to movement, to connection. And when that exchange stops, it feels unnatural. It feels like something is missing. This is where the deeper lesson begins. Not in changing the situation, but in learning how to remain steady within it. Because unreturned energy is not a failure, it is a condition. A moment where what you gave does not meet a response. And this moment can either create collapse or create strength. The difference lies in how it is held. At first, the instinct is to react, to pull back, to protect, to close off, or to reach again, to try harder, to fill the gap. But both of these responses come from discomfort, from the inability to sit with what is happening, and this inability creates movement. Movement that prevents stillness, movement that avoids the feeling. But what if the feeling is not something to avoid? What if it is something to understand? There is a quiet strength that develops when you allow yourself to feel without reacting. When you notice the discomfort of unreturned energy and do not immediately try to fix it. When you sit with the imbalance without trying to restore it. This sitting is not passive. It is active awareness. It is staying present with the feeling without letting it control your actions. And this presence creates space. A space where the feeling can exist without overwhelming you. At first, this space feels unfamiliar because the mind is used to resolving, used to acting, used to restoring balance quickly. But when you remain in the space without rushing, something begins to shift. The intensity softens, the urgency fades, the feeling becomes more manageable, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer being resisted. And in that acceptance, something changes. The energy that once felt like it needed to go outward begins to settle inward. It no longer feels like it has to be received to have value. It no longer feels like it has to be returned to feel complete. It begins to exist on its own. And this is where wholeness begins to return, because the need for reciprocity begins to loosen. Not in a way that denies its importance, but in a way that removes its control over your emotional state. You begin to see that your ability to care is not dependent on how it is received, that your capacity to give is not diminished by someone else's inability to return, that what you offer remains valuable even when it is not mirrored. This understanding creates stability, a stability that is not shaken by imbalance, a stability that does not collapse when things are not equal, a stability that remains even when the connection shifts. And from this stability, something deeper emerges, a sense of inner completeness. Not because everything is balanced, but because you are no longer depending on balance to feel whole. This is the essence of Buddhist steadiness, not the absence of discomfort, but the ability to remain present within it, to sit with what is happening without needing it to change, to feel without reacting, to allow without collapsing. And this steadiness changes everything, because now the experience of unreturned energy is no longer threatening. It is simply something that is happening. It does not define you. It does not diminish you. It does not require immediate action. It can be held gently, without resistance. And as this continues, something becomes clear. The pain was not coming from the lack of reciprocity alone. It was coming from the belief that your wholeness depended on it. And once that belief softens, the experience changes. The imbalance becomes less intense, the discomfort becomes more manageable, the need to fix it disappears. What remains is a quiet awareness, an understanding that connection can shift without taking away your stability, that care can exist without being mirrored, that presence can remain even when it is not returned in the same way. And in that understanding there is peace. A peace that does not require equality in every moment. A peace that does not depend on perfect balance. A peace that remains steady even when things feel uneven. This peace is not cold. It is not detached. It is grounded. It allows you to care without losing yourself, to feel without collapsing, to remain open without becoming dependent. And this openness is powerful, because it does not close off when things are not returned. It remains available but not attached, present but not seeking, giving but not needing. And in that way of being, something beautiful happens. The connection becomes lighter, not because it has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You are no longer trying to restore balance. You are no longer trying to fix the gap. You are simply allowing what is there. And in that allowing, there is freedom. Freedom from the need to control. Freedom from the pressure to maintain. Freedom from the collapse that once followed imbalance. And as this freedom deepens, something settles. The heart becomes steady. The mind becomes quiet. The body relaxes. Not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being forced. And in that stillness, something becomes clear. You are whole, even when your energy is not returned. You are complete, even when care is not mirrored. You are steady, even when the connection feels uneven. And that is where true strength lies, not in receiving, but in remaining, not in balance, but in presence, not in reciprocity, but in inner stability. And from that place, peace becomes unshakable, quiet, steady, always there, waiting beneath the need for things to be different. And once you rest in that place, nothing outside of you has the power to collapse you again. and as that steadiness begins to hold, something even more hidden starts to rise to the surface. When you no longer chase, when you no longer measure your worth, when you learn to sit with what is not returned, there is still one place the mind quietly turns toward: yourself. Not in a gentle way at first, but in a questioning way, a reviewing, correcting, almost judging way, as if something inside begins to look back and search for what went wrong, and without noticing it, the direction of pressure changes. It no longer comes from them. It comes from within. There is a quiet voice that begins to speak after emotional distance appears. It does not shout, but it repeats itself in subtle ways. It revisits conversations, but this time not to understand them, but to evaluate them. It asks questions that feel personal. Did I say too much? Was I too available? Did I push them away? Was I not enough? These questions do not come with curiosity, they come with weight, because each one carries an assumption that something about you caused the distance. And from that assumption, a pattern begins to form, a pattern of self-punishment. It may not look harsh on the outside, there may be no visible action, but internally something tightens. The mind begins to hold itself responsible. It starts to believe that if you had acted differently, things would have remained the same, and this belief creates tension, because it turns the situation into something that must be corrected, even though it has already passed. You may notice how often the mind replays not just what happened, but how you were within it. It focuses on your words, your tone, your timing, your presence, and it tries to adjust them, to improve them, to imagine a version of yourself that would have created a different outcome, and this imagining feels like learning, but beneath it there is pressure, because it is not about growth, it is about blame. A subtle blame that keeps pointing inward, as if something about you needs to be fixed, as if something about you was not right. And this creates discomfort, because the mind is not just processing the experience, it is turning against itself. This is where self-punishment begins to deepen, not through harsh actions, but through constant correction, through repeated thoughts that question your worth, through internal dialogue that is never fully satisfied. Because no matter how many times you review, the outcome does not change. And yet, the mind continues. It continues to search for the exact moment where something could have been different. It continues to analyze your behavior as if it holds the key. But this search does not bring peace. It brings exhaustion, because it is based on an illusion. The illusion that you could have controlled the outcome completely, that if you had been perfect, things would have remained. But human connection is not controlled by one person. It is influenced by many factors, many of which are not visible, not accessible, not within your control. And when you take full responsibility for something that is shared, it creates imbalance. An imbalance that leads to self-judgment. This is where compassion becomes essential, not as a concept, but as a practice, a way of relating to yourself that interrupts the pattern of punishment. At first, compassion may feel unfamiliar, because the mind is used to correction, used to evaluation, used to improvement, but compassion does not begin with fixing. It begins with understanding. Understanding that you responded in the way you knew at the time. Understanding that your actions came from a place of care, even if they were not perfect. Understanding that being human includes making choices that are not always ideal. This understanding softens the inner voice. It reduces the intensity of the questioning. It creates space where there was once pressure, and in that space, something changes. The need to blame begins to fade. The urge to correct every detail weakens. The constant review slows down. Not because the mind is forced to stop, but because it is no longer fueled by judgment. This is where the cycle begins to break. Not through resistance, but through kindness. A kindness that does not excuse everything, but that allows everything to be seen without harshness. You begin to notice the thoughts that arise, but instead of following them, you respond differently. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" You ask, "What was I feeling at that moment?" This shift is small but powerful because it moves the focus from judgment to understanding, from blame to awareness. And in that shift, something softens. The emotional weight begins to lift. The pressure reduces. The internal environment becomes calmer. This calm creates clarity, a clarity that allows you to see the situation more accurately, not through the lens of self-blame, but through the lens of reality. You begin to see that not everything was within your control, that not every outcome could have been changed, that not every action needed to be perfect. And this realization brings relief, a relief that comes from releasing responsibility that was never fully yours, a relief that allows you to let go of the constant need to fix yourself, a relief that creates space for acceptance. This acceptance is not resignation, it is acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of what happened, acknowledgement of how you were, acknowledgement of what you felt, without adding layers of judgment. And in that acknowledgement, something heals, because the mind no longer needs to defend or correct. It can simply rest. And as this rest deepens, something becomes clear. You do not need to punish yourself to learn. You do not need to blame yourself to grow. You do not need to fix every part of yourself to be worthy. Growth does not come from harshness. It comes from awareness, from seeing clearly, from understanding gently. And when this becomes your way of relating to yourself, everything changes. The inner voice becomes softer. The thoughts become lighter. The emotional experience becomes more stable. Because you are no longer creating conflict within yourself. You are creating support. This support is quiet. It does not demand. It does not pressure. It simply allows you to feel, allows you to reflect, allows you to exist without constant correction. And in that allowing, something settles. The need to revisit the past reduces. The urge to change what has already happened fades. The focus begins to return to the present, to what is here, to what is possible now. And from this place, something new becomes available. Not a perfect version of yourself, but a grounded one. One that is not defined by mistakes. One that is not shaped by judgment. One that is steady, even in reflection. This steadiness creates peace. A peace that is not dependent on being flawless. A peace that does not disappear when things go wrong. A peace that remains even when you see your imperfections, because those imperfections are no longer seen as problems, they are seen as part of being human. And in that understanding, something changes. You stop fighting yourself. You stop correcting every detail. You stop punishing every perceived mistake. And in that stopping, something opens. A sense of ease, a sense of acceptance, a sense of being okay as you are. This is where true healing begins, not in becoming perfect, but in becoming kind to yourself. And as this kindness deepens, the cycle of self-punishment comes to an end, not abruptly, but gradually, with each moment of awareness, with each shift in perspective, with each act of compassion. And in that ending, there is freedom, freedom from judgment, freedom from blame, freedom from the need to constantly fix yourself. What remains is something much lighter. A quiet sense of self that does not need to be improved to be accepted. A presence that is not weighed down by past actions. A calm that exists simply because you are no longer creating inner conflict. And in that calm, peace becomes natural again, not forced, not constructed, but present, always, within you. And as that inner softness begins to take hold, something else quietly reveals itself. When you stop blaming yourself, when the pressure to fix your past fades, there is still one habit that continues to keep the mind restless. A habit so subtle it feels normal. The need to interpret everything. Even in calm moments, even when nothing is clearly wrong, the mind begins to scan. It looks at messages, pauses, timing, tone, and tries to read between the lines. It tries to understand what is really being said beneath what is actually said. And without noticing it, the mind turns simple moments into complex signals. A message arrives, and instead of just reading it, something inside begins to question it. Why was it short? Why did it take longer this time? Why does it feel different? And the moment that could have passed quietly becomes something to analyze. There is a quiet tension that forms when the mind starts decoding everything. It no longer allows experiences to be simple. It no longer lets communication be direct. It assumes there is always something hidden. And this assumption creates movement, constant, subtle movement. The mind begins to break things down. A word becomes a clue, a delay becomes a sign, a change in tone becomes a message. And all of this happens quickly, almost automatically, because the mind believes it is protecting you. It believes that if it can understand everything, it can prevent confusion. But instead, it creates more of it. Because not everything carries hidden meaning. Not every message is layered. Not every pause is intentional. And when the mind treats everything as a signal, it begins to lose clarity. It becomes overwhelmed with interpretation. And this creates suffering. Not because something is happening externally, but because something is constantly happening internally. You may notice how difficult it becomes to feel calm when the mind is decoding everything. Even simple interactions feel heavy. Even neutral moments feel uncertain. Because nothing is taken at face value. Everything is questioned, everything is examined, everything is turned into something more. And this constant examination creates tension. A tension that does not allow rest. Because the mind is always working, always trying to understand, always trying to read beyond what is visible. This is where the deeper problem lies. Not in what is happening, but in how it is being processed. Because when every moment is turned into something that needs to be decoded, there is no space for stillness, no space for simplicity, no space for peace. This is where a shift begins. Not by forcing the mind to stop thinking, but by changing how it relates to what it sees, by allowing things to be as they appear, without adding layers, without searching for hidden meaning, without turning every detail into a question. At first, this feels unfamiliar because the habit of decoding is strong. The mind may say, if you do not analyze this, you will miss something important. But this is the same voice that has been creating the tension. And when you begin to not follow it, something changes. The experience becomes lighter. A message is just a message. A delay is just a delay. A tone is just a tone. Without the added interpretation, everything becomes simpler. And in that simplicity, there is relief. Because the mind no longer has to work as hard. It no longer has to process every detail. It no longer has to stay alert for hidden meaning. This creates space. A space where you can experience things directly, without distortion, without assumption, without unnecessary complexity. And in that space, something settles. The emotional intensity reduces, the mental noise softens, the overall experience becomes calmer. This calm is not forced. It arises naturally when the mind is no longer overactive. And as this calm deepens, something becomes clear. Not everything needs to be understood beyond what is visible. Not everything carries a deeper message. Not everything requires interpretation. Sometimes, what is there is enough. And when you allow that, the mind begins to trust. It trusts that it does not need to control every moment. It trusts that it can exist without constant analysis. It trusts that clarity does not come from decoding everything, but from allowing things to be. This trust changes how you move through the experience. You become less reactive, less suspicious, less driven by the need to understand everything, and more present, more grounded, more at ease. This ease is important because it restores balance. It brings the mind back to a natural state, a state where it can observe without interfering, where it can receive without questioning, where it can rest without needing to solve. and in this state, something opens, a sense of freedom, freedom from the constant need to interpret, freedom from the pressure to analyze, freedom from the habit of turning everything into a puzzle. And with this freedom, something else becomes possible. Connection, real connection, not one filtered through analysis, but one experienced directly, where you can listen without decoding, where you can respond without overthinking, where you can be present without searching for hidden meaning. This kind of connection is lighter, more genuine, more natural, because it is not being processed through layers of interpretation. It is being experienced as it is, and in that experience there is peace, a peace that does not depend on understanding everything, a peace that remains even when things are simple, a peace that allows you to exist without constant mental activity. And as this peace becomes more familiar, something becomes clear. The need to decode was never bringing clarity. It was creating confusion. It was turning simple moments into complex experiences. It was adding layers where none were needed. And once that habit begins to fade, everything changes. The mind becomes quieter. The heart becomes lighter. The overall experience becomes more stable. Because you are no longer creating unnecessary movement. You are allowing stillness. And in that stillness, serenity enters. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. In moments where the mind does not react. In moments where you do not question. In moments where you simply experience what is there. These moments may feel small, but they are powerful, because they show that something has shifted, that the mind is no longer controlling everything, that it is learning to rest. And as it continues to rest, something settles, a sense of ease, a sense of clarity, a sense of peace. Not because everything is understood, but because nothing is being overinterpreted. And in that simplicity, everything becomes lighter, more manageable, more real. This is the deeper lesson. That peace does not come from decoding every sign. It comes from letting signs be signs, from allowing moments to be moments, from experiencing life without turning it into something more. And when this is truly understood, the mind relaxes, the tension fades, the constant questioning stops. What remains is something much simpler, a quiet presence, a steady awareness, a calm that does not depend on interpretation. And in that calm, peace becomes natural again, always there, waiting beneath the need to understand everything. And once you stop decoding, you finally begin to feel. And as that quiet simplicity begins to settle, something even more delicate begins to reveal itself. When you stop decoding every message, when you allow things to be as they are, there is still one subtle attachment that can quietly remain beneath everything. It is not about understanding anymore, it is about significance. A quiet desire begins to surface, one that is not always spoken, but deeply felt. The desire to be different, to be the one person they would never treat like the others, the one who would not be left, not be forgotten, not be replaced. And without noticing it, the heart begins to hold on to something very specific, the need to be the exception. There is a feeling that sits beneath many reactions, even when the mind has become quieter. It is not loud, but it carries weight. A subtle expectation that your connection was meant to be different, that it was supposed to last, that it was supposed to mean more. And when things begin to change, this expectation becomes painful, because it feels like something that should not have happened. You may notice how the mind compares, not just between past and present, but between you and others. It asks questions that are not always spoken clearly. Why did this happen to me? Why was I not different? Why did I not become the one they stayed for? These questions carry a quiet longing, a longing to have been chosen in a way that felt permanent, to have been the person who stood apart, the person who mattered in a way that could not be replaced. And this longing creates attachment, not just to the person, but to the idea of being special in their life. And when that idea is challenged, something inside feels shaken. Because it is not just the connection that is changing, it is the identity you held within that connection, the identity of being someone who was different, someone who was not like the others, someone who would not be left behind. This identity feels comforting when things are stable, but when things shift, it becomes fragile. Because it depends on something outside of you. It depends on how they see you, how they treat you, how they prioritize you. And when those things change, the identity begins to crack. This is where suffering deepens, because now it is not just about losing connection. It is about losing a sense of specialness, a sense that you held a unique place. And this loss can feel personal, not because you are less, but because the idea of being the exception has been challenged. This is where Buddhist understanding offers a quiet but powerful shift. It invites you to see that the need to be the exception is still a form of attachment. An attachment to identity, an attachment to being seen in a certain way, an attachment to holding a specific place in someone else's life. And like all attachments, it creates tension. Because it tries to hold something that cannot be fixed. People's feelings change, their priorities shift, their attention moves, and no matter how meaningful a connection feels, it does not guarantee permanence. This is not a failure, it is part of the nature of human experience. But the mind resists this. It wants something stable, something unchanging, something that confirms your importance. And this is where the desire to be the exception becomes strong, because it promises that stability. It promises that you will not be treated like everyone else, that your place will be secure, that your connection will not fade. But this promise is not something that can be controlled. It is an idea, a hope. And when reality does not match that hope, the gap creates pain. This is where humility begins to play a role, not as something that lowers you, but as something that frees you. Humility allows you to see that you do not need to be the exception to have value, that your worth is not tied to being irreplaceable, that your presence does not need to stand above others to be meaningful. This understanding softens the grip. The need to be special begins to loosen. The attachment to being different begins to fade. And in that fading, something changes. The pressure disappears. The need to hold a certain place in someone's life reduces. The comparison stops, because you are no longer measuring yourself through their perspective. You are returning to your own. And in that return, there is relief. A quiet relief that comes from not needing to be anything specific. Not needing to be the one they never leave, not needing to be the person who stands apart, not needing to hold a permanent position in their life. This relief creates space, a space where you can exist without carrying the weight of expectation, a space where you can feel without needing to be defined by the connection, a space where your value is not tied to how you are seen by another. And in that space, something settles. The heart becomes lighter, the mind becomes quieter, the overall experience becomes more peaceful, because you are no longer trying to hold on to something that cannot be guaranteed. You are allowing things to be as they are. And in that allowance, something becomes clear. You do not lose your value when you are not the exception. You do not become less when someone chooses differently. You do not diminish when a connection changes. Your worth remains, unaffected, independent. And as this understanding deepens, something shifts in how you relate to others. You no longer seek to be placed above. You no longer need to stand apart. You simply connect, without the need for identity, without the need for specialness, without the need for permanence. This kind of connection is freer because it is not carrying expectation. It is not trying to secure a position. It is not trying to prove anything. It simply exists. And in that existence, there is ease, a natural flow that is not forced, a presence that is not heavy, a feeling that is not tied to outcome. This is where peace begins to deepen. Not because everything is certain, but because nothing is being held too tightly. You are no longer gripping the idea of being the exception. You are no longer attaching your worth to how you are treated. You are simply present. And in that presence, something beautiful happens. The heart opens, but it does not cling. The mind observes, but it does not compare. The self remains steady and unchanged. And from that place, everything feels different. Not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You are no longer trying to be chosen in a special way. You are no longer needing to be irreplaceable. You are no longer seeking a permanent place in someone else's life. You are simply being. And in that being, there is freedom. A freedom that does not depend on how others see you. A freedom that does not fluctuate with their choices. A freedom that remains quietly within you. And in that freedom, peace becomes natural, steady, unforced, always there, waiting beneath the need to be anything more than what you already are. Something inside you has already started to change. You are no longer chasing answers the way you used to. You are no longer begging for closure that was never given. You are no longer measuring your worth through someone else's silence, effort, or attention. You have seen something deeper. That overthinking was never about them. It was about the mind trying to control what it could not hold, trying to protect what it could not keep, trying to understand what was never meant to be explained. And now something is softer. You see that peace does not come from clarity, from replies, from reassurance, or from being chosen. It comes from letting go of the need for all of it. It comes from returning to yourself, from sitting with what is, from allowing life to move without forcing it to stay. This is where your power is, not in being remembered, not in being the exception, not in being chased, but in being steady within yourself. And once you taste that stillness, even for a moment, you realize something important. Nothing that leaves takes your peace with it, unless you follow it. So if something in this spoke to you, if you felt a shift even slightly, drop a comment below and write, "I choose peace." Let it be your quiet decision, your turning point, your reminder. And if you want more of this, more clarity, more calm, more freedom from the noise in your mind, subscribe to the channel and stay with this journey. Because the more you return to yourself, the less anything outside of you can shake you, and that is where true peace begins.